Alrighty, chat. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational or entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. So today we're doing something super cool. We are going to be talking with Dan Clancy, the CEO of the one, the only, the platform Twitch.tv. So Dan, we're going to be talking about all kinds of stuff. So Dan and I actually met at the Streamies a few months ago, and we had an awesome conversation about mental health. And it was like really cool. Like I had no idea that the guy was just so incredibly knowledgeable about mental health. And so today we're going to be talking about whatever we kind of feel like talking about. We'll learn hopefully a little bit about Dan's personal story. We'll talk a little bit about mental health. So I had some questions for Dan about, you know, what he thinks is going on with mental health in the world right now. So we'll get his take on that, which I know sounds kind of weird, right? Because he's not like a mental health professional, but like, trust me, the guy knows a ton. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. And then also a little bit about his experience of running Twitch and what that's like. We are going to also, just as a quick FYI, we have a stream coming up on Friday that is going to be a deep dive into asexuality. So we're going to be talking about, it'll be probably about 2 hours, and we're going to dive into asexuality. So when we use the term asexual, first of all, what does that mean? What is kind of the differential diagnosis of it? So if someone feels like they're asexual, does that mean that, is this an illness? Is it a sexual variation? Could it be a little bit of both? And so, for example, I know that we sort of commonly accept it, right, as a sexual variant, which we'll talk about. But then there are also some medical conditions that lead to reduced libido. And so we'll also discuss a little bit about, for asexual people this is like a variant, why they are asexual, or what we know about the biology or neuroscience of asexuality. So that's going to be on Friday. But today we're going to actually just hop in with Dan, and we're going to talk about mental health and get to know him a little bit. Oh, hey, Dan. Okay.
There it is. It's
hey, Dan.
Gone.
Let me.
Hey, Dr. K.
There we go. How are you today?
And I'm doing well. And let me ask you, okay, the question is answered. So give me 2 seconds, because I wasn't sure if we were both going to be in the Discord thing. This is perfect, because I think it'll be better this way,
sure,
the way you have it. So I'm just configuring my OBS so that way we are side by side with my camera. And I think that actually looks pretty good.
Awesome.
And then let me see. Yeah, looks perfect.
Awesome, dude.
All right.
How are you?
I think we're all set, and which is actually pretty good. You know, we kind of, like, I'm usually, my chat is much more used to like the 10-minute of technical configuration, you know.
Yeah, you'd think that I would have figured it out by now too, but I have to still configure things.
No, I think, you know, the funny thing is that that's part of when you know, they put on different shows, the magic of Twitch is the fact that it doesn't have to all be perfect right when you start, because people like to see people just hang out and chat, you know?
That is certainly one of the most magical elements of Twitch. So my first question for you, Dan, is what is it that you have in the background? It looks like you've got a painting of some kind.
I do have a painting of some kind. Now I'm going to feel bad because my wife got that painting at one point. And it does have Indian you know, foundations. I know that, you know, the painting did come from you know, some type of, you know, Indian Hindu artist, but I can't tell you
that's totally fine.
exactly, you know, what it is. And especially since I'm talking to you, I feel like I should know.
No, I mean, it's not your painting, so it's all good. So sorry to put you on the spot. I just got curious.
Well, and also part of it too is, you know, it is kind of, you know, she bought it, but it is my painting. But you know, sometimes it's just paintings that you like, you know, and you don't always know the and that's especially true with things that come from rich cultural heritage, because often there is all sorts of meaning in the different pieces, but you see your own meaning in there.
Absolutely. So, Dan, can you start by actually telling us a little bit about, like, I'd love to learn about you. Is that cool?
Yeah, that's no problem. It's funny when I interview people for a job, I often say, "Well, tell me who you are." And I say, of course, in telling me who you are, you might talk to me some about what you've done. Okay, but what you've done is not who you are. What
Hmm.
you've done is just what you've done. And it's funny usually when that someone answers me that question, I of course people want to know what have you done. But I'll start by talking about who I am,
Yeah, I'd
and
love to hear that.
I'll weave in what I've done into part of that.
Sure, sounds
Right.
great.
Um, what I've realized, what I am is a problem solver. I'm a
Okay.
problem solver, and I like interesting problems. I like to think through different solutions to different problems. And I'm also very, as with most of us, I value and foster and spend a lot of time in terms of interpersonal interactions. And as I look at, my life and my career, those are two things that are a big part of my life. Getting to one of the things at some point that we'll probably talk about today, I'm a big believer that uh, we all put ourselves in these boxes and limit ourselves by the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and what we do. And here, I'm going to turn the camera down a little bit. I realize it's, and so I'll tell a story that kind of, tells a story of kind of my journey
Hmm.
where in when I went to school as originally I was going to be a theater and a math major.
Hmm.
And I spent a lot of time doing theater in high school, but I was also really good at math. So I was like, oh, I'll do theater and math. I took my very first computer science class and it was easy. And I said, oh, well, maybe I should do this instead of math. And so I became a computer science major and a theater major. In college, I spent far more time doing theater than computer science. Um, uh, but when I got out, I decided I didn't want to do theater, although I did talk about it. I think about it a lot. And there's this whole other life I could have led where I probably would have ended up being a director or producer or something. I wouldn't have been a performer. Um, but anyway, I went and used my computer science degree, got a PhD in AI at University of Texas, then went off to NASA where I led a lot of their computer science research in AI and robotics
When was
and
this,
autonomy.
Dan? What?
Where?
When?
When? I finished my PhD in 98. So I
Okay.
went to NASA in 98 and I was there from 98 to 2005
Okay.
was when I ran. I was at NASA Ames
So
in
you were
California.
doing AI before it was cool.
Well, it's interesting. It was a little cool in the 80s, in the early 90s. It actually was a little cool. And then I came out when it was called the AI winter. And so it was not cool by
Hmm.
the time I graduated, everybody was like AI, yeah, that's this stuff that didn't work. And boy, has it come back around. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, and so I worked at NASA for 7 years and did a bunch of their computer science stuff, and then went to Google. And at Google, I started by running this project, Google Book Search, that now many people don't really know what it was, but it was like got a lot of press in the news at that point. And then did a bunch of stuff at Google, but I also ran YouTube's product and engineering for a while, which is relevant to this audience and community. And ran a research team in AI for a few years, and then left Google and went to this startup Nextdoor, which is a social network for your neighborhood. Took off a year, and then I came to Twitch. So that's a quick. But in all of this, as I said, I'm a problem solver. I came out as an engineer, but my whole career sometimes I'll do legal stuff, sometimes I'll do product stuff, sometimes I'll do business stuff. I kind of do whatever is the interesting problem, you know, that I'm struggling with. And by the way, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to turn on these lights in front of
Sure.
me because it will be a little bit better. There we go. All right.
So, Dan, is it okay if I ask a couple questions about your
You can ask as many
Okay.
questions as you want.
And if I ask you anything, I know we discussed a little bit ahead of time about what's okay, not okay, and so let me know
I
if
think
anything.
anything's not okay.
Or you'll let me know, right?
Boy, well, I'll let you know. But
Okay.
I will bet you $100 right now you won't ask me a question that's not okay.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
if I wanted to make $100,
$100, you could probably win it. I know. No, I realize the
yeah.
bet there,
No. So
probably.
sort of curious. So when you say that you're a problem solver, what about like when you were a kid? What was your childhood
Yeah.
like?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer that so much of our so many things in our life just synergistically work together. So and it relates to what you do. So I grew up I grew up a family of 7 kids.
Wow.
My dad died interestingly before I was born.
Oh my
I
goodness.
have one older brother, and he died in a plane crash because he was flying home. It was his first Father's Day. I have an older brother who's a year older than me, and my dad was a doctor, and it was his first Father's Day, and my mom was just recently pregnant with me. Okay, so nobody knew she was pregnant, although I'm sure he knew, and he had a Cessna or something like that, and he wanted to fly home to see her for his first Father's Day, and because I think he knew that she was pregnant, and he flew through a storm that he shouldn't have flown through. In fact, they
Oh
told
my
him not to
goodness.
fly through it, and crashed and died in the plane crash. My mom remarried, and by the time I have any memory, I had a dad because she was remarried by the time I was 2.5, so I don't remember not having a dad, and he raised me and my brother as his own, and then we had 5 younger brothers and sisters. But my mom had a fairly acute drinking problem, and she's a good Irish Catholic, so having a drinking problem is part of her tradition as an Irish Catholic. 5 of her 6 brothers and sisters all had drinking problems, um, and so I was the second oldest, and at points like when I was in high school, it was fairly acute. And she would still take care of all the kids.
What do you mean by the term? I know you have a pretty
Yeah,
robust background in understanding these
yeah.
terms, but can you explain to us what the term acute means?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, that it manifested itself. It was very present in our lives. She would drink every night. She would work there and take care of the kids. But at 5 o'clock, she was at the kitchen table with a beer, and by 7 or 8, she'd be quite drunk. And I was as the second oldest, it was my job to sort of provide, some sort of peace amongst order amongst some degree of chaos, right? Because, it was very loving. My dad was loving. My mom was very loving, but,
Sure.
alcohol just does that. And as is often the case in dysfunctional families, my brother was more the kind of outspoken, get upset, go, and I was more the peacemaker. And with 5 younger brothers and sisters, I would kind of, help to make sure that, um, uh, everything worked out. In other words, if there was tension in here or there, I would kind of solve it. And it's very interesting in my career because in my career, I've actually, at numerous times in my career, I've gone and worked as the sort of number 2 for a kind of founder CEO. And Emmett was like that. That was, kind of would jump into things. He'd thrash teams. He'd, kind of
Hmm.
create some degree of disorder. And I was exceptionally good at creating order amongst some degree of disorder. And I learned that I got very good at that. I was
Yeah.
trained in that. And I often said, and the other thing that I did, because and this was not the case at Twitch, but it was kind of the case at Nextdoor, um, uh, I would stay in some, I would just stay. That in fact, because if if you understand alcoholism, sometimes people play different roles, right? And some people escape it, and some people are that consistency that stays, right? And kind of my role was to just be there, and I would do that in work
So
because I would get
yeah, Dan. So once again, I know you understand this stuff really well.
yeah,
Sometimes this is the kind of stuff that
yes,
I will talk about what I'm imagining is that there are people out there who are listening to this that you probably just struck a chord with, right? So like
Yeah.
I'm imagining people who are maybe 16, 17, 18, or even 21, 22, coming home for the holidays, for holiday break from university or whatever, and they have not quite, these same dynamics are playing on in their house. So the rate of alcoholism is somewhere around 6%.
Yep.
And so if you kind of consider that,
And even aside from alcoholism, if you go to mental illness, I mean, a lot of people grow up with a parent that suffers from mental illness, and really all of these are different forms of dysfunction that then ripples through the family. And so whether it's alcoholism or mental illness that maybe a parent has, it can have similar, so the numbers are actually much larger in terms of people growing up in a household that has some type of dysfunction.
absolutely. And I already love, like, this is so cool, right? Because this is normally like the job of someone who's like an executive coach or a psychiatrist or therapist is, hey, let's look at the way that you were trained growing up and apply that to the dynamics in your professional life. And you're already going there. So what I'd love to hear from you is actually a little bit more color, because I can imagine that these conclusions you're drawing make perfect sense to you. It's clear to me that you've already thought this stuff through. You realize these things, but I can imagine there are going to be younger people who are kind of at the cusp of this.
Right. They don't, that if you're, I understand.
So can you tell us like a little bit more about, next door, and you're the one who stays? Like, that's a really powerful statement.
Well, the interesting thing is, before I talk about I'm the one that stays, let me talk about when I decided not to be the one to stay. And it was important in my development because when I went off to college, and in fact, one thing that often happens in dysfunctional families is part of your development is sort of muted because you're dealing with all of the challenge in the families. And I went off to college, and now I was living by myself, and there are all sorts of who I was that started to develop. And I kind of had to start to discover who I am when I got to college. Of course, everybody does this to some degree. And my mom, who was a loving, sweetheart, wonderful woman, but also, controlling at times, and would like use guilt, whenever I would do something in high school. And I will quickly, I'm going to tell a funny story real quick, and then I'll come around to your question, but it's relevant. I always remember this one funny story I tell of my family, that it was after my freshman year, and my family would go to Colorado every summer to this place, YMCA Camp of the Rockies, and spend a month there. And I really wanted to spend the summer in New Orleans because I was starting to hang out with friends. And in fact, my mom had never wanted me to have a job because she says, well, you should study. You don't need to have a job. And I had gotten a job at McDonald's. Okay. And I went and told my mom, I said, I don't think I'm going to go to Colorado this year because, I want to stay in New Orleans and hang out with my friends. And I have a job for the first time. I was excited. And she was like, oh, well, if you're not going to go, then I won't go, Dan. That's okay. No. I will stay here with you, which, of course, created a lot of strife in the family because all my younger brothers and sisters were going as a family. And my dad came and said to me, he said, Dan, I just want you to know that this is causing a great deal of strife in the family. And if you decide not to go to Colorado, then you cannot bring your car back to school next year because that's a privilege, and I don't think you need that there. And you cannot bring, it was an old car, but I had it at school second, you cannot. And I said, fine, Dad, I don't want your car. Right? I was like, and then, of course, at night, my rational brain kicked in, and I said, hold on a second. I'm going to stay in New Orleans for a month to work at McDonald's, and then I'm not going to have my car at school. I said, as opposed to going and vacationing at Estes Park, Colorado. And so I gave in the next morning. And I went, and I had fun, and I didn't work at McDonald's that summer. But when I went to college, I never really went back to the home after going to college. I had to escape to come to some degree. And I was very aware I didn't spend I used to spend a ton of time with my younger brothers and sisters, and I'd still visit, but I wouldn't call all the time. I wasn't really emotionally, they would go on vacations. I wouldn't be on my vacations because I was 22. I was like living my life. I was in college. I'd bring my college friends home. and like because I had a very tight bond with my younger brothers and sisters when I was in high school. I took care of them all the time.
Yeah.
But then when I went to college, I wasn't, I like, and I needed that. In other words, the only way that I could fully develop and get over that kind of obligation that I felt like, because whenever she would say, oh no, you don't do it, Dan, I'll take care of it, right? That Catholic guilt, right? I would
I'm
jump
confused.
in.
Your mom would say that?
My mom, yeah, yes,
And
yes.
what was she referring to?
She would, if anything, like that's, I mean, and again, people talk about Catholic guilt. She would want me to do something. And as opposed to just saying, no, you have to do it, she'd go, no, I'll do it. In other words, she would take it on herself. Dan, could you pick up your sister from school? No, I'm going out with friends. Oh, okay, don't worry, I'll do it. Right.
I
And
see.
so I would feel guilty. Right. I would feel all, and so I'd say, no, 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 I don't need to go out with my friends. I'll go ahead and pick them up. I'll go ahead and, I'll go ahead and do that. So in the end, I would put aside what I wanted to do what I needed to do to help the family. Right. And eventually, the only way I worked through that was by getting out of that environment. And there was a period of time where I wasn't as emotionally connected to my siblings. Right. I was still like, it's not I disappeared, but I just like, again, I wouldn't go on family vacations. I'd say, oh, I've got this going on. I was living my life.
And as you started to separate, like, is it okay if I jump in with questions?
Yeah. Yeah.
So as you started to like separate like that, what was your internal experience of that like, right? Because I'm imagining that there's probably thousands of people who will listen to this who will be like in a very similar situation of, being kind of drawn in emotionally and not allowed to develop.
Yeah. Interestingly, it was only in hindsight that I was aware. I aware I was doing this. In other words, as soon as I was physically separated, and I know I talked to friends that care for their parents, that had a role in caring for their parents, and sometimes I tell them, especially when they're in the same city with that parent, I said, "You're not going to break this if you're in the same city. It's just too like you did it as a child, you're doing it as an adult. Your parent, yes, your mom, your dad, whatever, they're separated. That like, um, uh, it's too hard if you're living in the same city." Because you're in the same patterns. And so I reflect on it now and know that because, we respond to our environment, which is one reason why when someone does have a challenge, for someone on your show that, is like, has had a trouble drinking or with addiction, right? And I know my son, and we can talk about this later, my son, he had went to a wilderness therapy program because he had some bad behavior patterns. And, at the end of that, they strongly suggest kids don't go back to the same school. Because the reality is, when we are in an environment with stimulus in which we behaved a certain way, as soon as we go back into that environment, and a lot of people experience that, they go back and they stay in their childhood, room. And suddenly they start falling into the same patterns they had with their siblings when they were 13 or their parents, right? And they start
Mm-hmm.
playing that role of a child. And that's because as humans, we respond to, physical stimulus and behave a certain way. And so the only way I was able to break out of that stimulus was not to be in the same physical environment. I grew up in New Orleans, so I had to not be in New Orleans, right? I had to be at school. And now I realize what was happening.
So,
Okay. At the
but
time, I didn't.
subjectively, did you feel like guilty or did you feel liberated
Oh,
or like what was like your
of
experience of
course.
college like?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it was always this, tension. I felt liberated. And then if I wouldn't go home at a certain time, right, I'd feel a little guilty, right? But because I had the distance, like the summer after my sophomore year, I decided to go spend the summer in Boston. I didn't go. Summer after my freshman year, I went home to New Orleans. And that's the story I told. Summer after my sophomore year, I was in a theater camp in Boston. Summer after my,
Mm.
junior year, I got a job and lived in North Carolina. So, after that first summer after my freshman year, I would visit for 2 weeks. But I always found something to do in the summer, right? And I wasn't conscious that that's what I was
Yeah,
doing.
but you were like, yeah, this definitely. I mean,
It
so
was
it's
like,
maybe
oh, I want to
subconscious.
do this, right?
Yeah.
And it was important that I did that. It was important that I found that space to start figuring out who I was. And the interesting part of the journey is, of course, that journey happens throughout your life. Like this idea that you find out who you are by the time you're 22 or 24 or 34 or 44 or 54, right? Is this fallacy, right?
Hmm.
We're always finding out who we are.
Wow. Yeah. So it sounds like you started to kind of really individuate, and you mentioned you've used this term dysfunctional family a couple of times. Can you help us understand what does that mean? What makes a family dysfunctional?
Yeah, good question. Well, the interesting thing, we always like these labels, right, and these boxes. And of course, we think of, oh, either it's a functional family or it's a dysfunctional family. And of course, there's no such binarization of the world. In fact, every family is dysfunctional to some degree, and every family is functional to some degree, right? So I think, and so as opposed to putting the label on the family, because so many people, they they feel like, oh, but I came from a functional family, so now I don't have that, right? We all, the way I would describe it is, as humans, we all look for different things to help us in our development. And of course, our parents play a huge role in providing an environment that gives us comfort, gives us food, gives us sense of, belonging and worth. Um, and of course, our parents have their own challenges that are in their life, right? And our parents, and as a parent myself, um, since they are all in the same way we are all broken and we are all perfect at the same time, but they are all broken. Um, and then that manifests itself in certain ways in, the environment for their children, right? And, I use it, but, now interestingly, I use it out of habit because I now more and more think that binarization, and for people, when I say binarization, I mean splitting the world into these two halves of dysfunctional family, functional family, right? Is just a fallacy and a flaw. And that in fact what it is life is messy and there are all these dimensions, and some of us have greater challenges than others. And the one thing I've learned is whatever your challenges are, the one thing I guarantee you is there's someone else sitting on this planet that had more acute challenges than you. Somewhere there's someone on this planet that you can argue, no, their challenges were worse than any of the other 10 billion people. But the reality is we all have challenges, and we have to accept that, and we all have to overcome them.
What's the utility of thinking about someone having it worse than you?
Um, a huge part of our thinking is looking for excuses to do the easy thing, right? Oh, well, here's why this bad thing is happening to me, because, and this idea that life is happening to us, right? Versus us being active agents in our life, right? And so that mindset that we're taught of kind of thinking, oh, well, let me tell you how tough I've had it. Okay. What that does is it limits us, because that's telling your brain that you can't do it, and it's giving you like the reason why not. Now, the interesting thing, it's both powerful to give yourself a reason why you're imperfect, right? Because you can say, look, but at the same time, when you realize there are other people that also face this challenge, then you realize you're not alone.
Hmm.
Right? Because this sense that everyone is facing this and everyone has a different challenge, right? And I'm very acute of this because, of course, I'm aware that my mom, had a drinking problem, but as a white male, okay, in our society, like in the spectrum, you know, my problems actually pale in comparison because, they could provide for me. I went to Duke for a school. I've had an extremely cherished life. And so we often focus on those things that are our banners, right? But like, there's no world where I should not realize I've been blessed to the 100th degree compared to most people on this planet, and just living in America, right? There are people in America that have it tough. There are people in India that it's just like unimaginable to think what they, what some of the children there, in terms of poor children, need to fight through. So I think it's feeling that, you're not alone. There are other people that are struggling. And now, how do you make the best of your life?
I thought that was so interesting what you said about our mind makes excuses to do the easy thing. And then you also implied that we're taught that. Can you share a little bit about how do we learn, or how are we taught that? What is that? How does that happen? How are we taught to do this?
And it's interesting. Different people are taught different things. There's what our parents tell us. There's what society tells us, right? And we absorb all these things. So it's in many different ways. So there isn't one way. So I'll pick a way, and then that can see, one of the challenges I think in parents today is they want to avoid their child experiencing suffering or pain. And so they want them to have success, and they want to, glorify that success, and they want to shield them from pain and hurt. And I know when I reflect on myself as a parent, I did this with my kids at times, right? And it is in shielding them from this pain and hurt, we are, teaching them, right, to just yearn for success as opposed to struggling with, uncomfortable feelings, right? And so I think there are all sorts of things that send small signals, right, about avoiding accepting who we are, and then taking a challenge and becoming somebody else, right?
Yeah.
One thing we can talk about, I talk about this a lot now, about the boxes we put ourselves in that limit us. And I think there's just so many ways that we and everyone else limit us. They put you in a box by both your strengths, and they say, well, this is who you are, right? This is your strength. And then we put ourselves in the same box, and we don't realize the things that we can do.
Yeah, I've seen something very similar in terms of, as we prioritize success and as we applaud success, what a lot of kids, I think in our community, have had this experience. I certainly had this, where, we're taught that success is everything. 4.0 GPA. I'm the child of two physicians, so expectations were high. And so what's kind of interesting is that what you end up doing is selecting. So then the child starts selecting for things that they're going to be successful in, which in turn means that they start avoiding things that are difficult. Yep. And as you choose the easy thing, because you want to be successful, you start actually like crumbling in terms of your capability.
Yep.
You can no longer do difficult things. And so then your life becomes narrower and narrower and narrower.
Yep.
And now anytime you're faced with a challenge, you've never had practice with challenges.
Yep.
And if you've never practiced with challenges, then you feel overwhelmed by challenge.
You feel unable to meet the challenges. And then your mind keeps telling yourself, I can't.
Exactly. Right. And because in a sense, that's true, because you haven't. But the moment that I haven't becomes I can't, that's the moment at which your past determines your future.
Yep.
And I'm really hearing this from you, that this sort of idea that a lot of what holds us back, and I think that this is, if we talk about this, I've been studying a lot about the theory of karma recently. And just really one of the big realizations I've had is, one of the things that's changing in the world is we really view ourselves as victims of our environment, because there's a ton of evidence for this, right? that there's all this kind of stuff going on in the world. And so the world is getting worse, and there's inflation, and 50% of people under the age.
The world is always getting wet. The world is always getting worse, but for some reason, this is the best time to be alive. But yes, but it's always getting worse.
Yeah. So there's always things that seem to be getting worse. Yes. And so what happens is I've noticed that what I kind of see in the world today is that people look at the world and they say, I cannot solve this. The world is bad because of this. I cannot solve this problem, and therefore I cannot do anything. And the real tragedy there is that the moment that you begin to think that I can't do anything is the moment at which it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
And then once it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, then it becomes evidence.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, I can't fix the world. See, I was right. And then what you end up convincing yourself of is that you're powerless. And it's not that you're wrong. I think all of these people are very logical, but they happen to be incomplete, I would say is the way to look at it. But it's really
I'm going to take that and I'm going to use an example because of course it's of course for anyone listening, they hear that and they go, oh, that makes sense. Okay, so what do I do? Okay, and I'll use an example of something I did and I did this about 5 years ago or so. And some people will understand it because I basically gamified a message that I had been telling myself. So I was always a fairly active person, but I mostly did ball sports. I didn't think of myself as an endurance person, right? I didn't run regularly. I didn't bike, but I'd say, oh yeah, I'm not really a runner. Okay, and slowly I put on weight. Okay, as you do in your 50s. Right. And suddenly, and I play basketball regularly, but I was like, I'm just not. And so I decided I wanted to start running regularly. Okay. But this time, different from every other time, was I said, I'm going to run 5 times a week and at least 1 mile on a run. And I'd run 10 miles over those 5 times. And I was going to count the number of weeks in a row I could do it. Okay. And see how many I could do it in a row in a row and say, oh, I'd hit 14. And then the next time I try to hit 15. Okay. And of course, there are a lot of gamers that watch this, so they understand this idea. And so I gamified me running because I had a goal.
Yeah, so that's so interesting because I think I would say that the majority of experiences I've heard is that people try to do that, but it doesn't end up working.
Let me tell you what I think was the key. The key in that was the 5 days a week. Because most people in the past, I always said, oh, I'll run 3 days a week. Okay. If it's not a daily habit, I made it a daily habit. Okay. And every other day habit is really hard to maintain. And every 3-day habit is really hard to maintain. We aren't created to have every 3-day habits. We are created to have daily habits that sometimes don't happen. Okay. The epitome of this, of course, is using social media, and that's often negative because it's a daily habit, and maybe there's one day where you don't, God forbid, but it's also multiple times a day. So because in the past, whenever I tried to do it, I would say, oh, I'm going to do it 3 times a week. And 3 would become 2. And then I said, I'm going to try to do it every day. But there were 2 days a week where I could miss it. Right? And part of this was I started doing something simple. The other key was I said 1 mile counted.
What do you mean by that?
I said running 1 mile counted towards this goal.
Okay, I see.
Okay. Usually it used to be I'd say I'm going to run 3 miles a day. And then I'd sit there and go, shit, 3 miles. Oh God, I'm tired. I don't know if I want to run 3 miles. Oh, that's hard. But 1 mile, which would take me about 11 minutes, like when can I not find 11 minutes? Right? And so I both made it a daily habit and I made the minimum thing something that at any point in time, it would be 11 o'clock at night. I'd be busy. I'd say, well, I can freaking run a mile. It's 11 minutes.
Yeah, that's a great point. I find that when I'm working with people and even in my own life, I think there's a very so people are oftentimes ask me, how do you figure out what's the right amount? 3 miles, 1 mile, what is it? And what I kind of settle on is this idea of bang it out. So there are certain tasks that you can bang them out, right? Like you can just kind of get it done. And if it
Just
is a
do it.
task that you can, if it's too big of a task to bang it out, then it's too big. But it's the kind
Yeah.
of thing that you can squeeze it in or bang it out in a very small amount of time. So like even in terms of like I'm cleaning my office right now and like the office is somewhat of a mess, but it's the kind of thing where I focus on doing something that I can bang it out. So yesterday I was watching some professional Dota, and while I was watching professional Dota, I could bang out the amount of cleaning that I wanted to do. And so I think usually it's like sub 30 minutes is like what I'm usually shooting for. Sometimes even 5-7 minutes, and it's the kind of
Yes.
thing where you can scrape out 11 minutes, you can
Yes.
scrape out 5 minutes.
Yes.
And so it's
Yeah,
interesting
it's
to
interesting. I found that because it was small, and I agree, it's just bang it out, right? And I actually think even 30 minutes, because I know now, again, I exercise a lot now. When like, if I bring it down to 15, right? If I have to find 30 minutes, I always have an excuse. If I bring it down to 15, it's like it's freaking fit. I think there's something about 15 minutes because, you can always squeeze in 15 minutes somewhere. And so for me, the two things was the atomic action was something I could always bang it out.
Mhm.
And then I turned it into a daily habit.
Yeah, awesome. So I just want to circle back to a couple of other things that
Yeah.
you were saying. So we were hearing a little bit about, so we talked a little bit about dysfunctional family. You were saying that, you know, you're not a big fan of the binary term anymore. At the same time, and we can move on to something else if you want. Is there something in particular that, when you started using the term to describe your family, what does it look like? Because I think a big challenge with dysfunctional families is that one of the biggest things I've learned as a psychiatrist is that people grow up thinking something is normal. So I grew up in a particular kind of household, and so as a simple example, I grew up in a household where there was one person who was probably quite narcissistic, and the whole family kind of revolved around this person, and so
Yep.
I thought that was normal, and so I thought
Mhm.
it was kind of like a completely normal sort of situation. And then what I sort of ended up doing is comparing my life to other people's lives and noticing that, okay, my life is different from other people's lives. And I didn't really account for the fact that their households did not have a person like this. Right.
Mhm.
So what are some of the ways in which, there are people out there who are going to be listening to this who think, okay, my family is normal. And just like you kind of said, you didn't realize, you thought that this was normal. So what were some of the things that you recognize now, which every family has its own dysfunctionalities, completely agree. What were some of the things that you saw that you did not think were normal in retrospect?
I think the biggest thing, and it's interesting, was that when she wasn't drinking, she was such a good parent. And then she wouldn't really be there, right? Because there'd be times in the day where she was like handling everything. And so the interesting thing is that dichotomy of like being incredibly attentive and like self-serve, because she did not think of herself at all. She would cook, she'd do everything for the kids. And then for suddenly it not to be there because now then that dichotomy was hard for the adjustment, right? Because it's like the younger kids couldn't like handle the fact that suddenly that person that was so attentive and then suddenly they weren't there because of course you adapt in different situations. And here it would be within a day, right? Between 9 in the morning and 5:30, it was like and then from 5:30 to 10, it was like, nope.
And so how did you deal with that?
Interesting. I think that was sort of the role that I played because in fact, more I would then, without even thinking about it, I would be more engaged. Like, in other words, I would like feel like I needed to be there more in the evening, and I would like I would accommodate, right? Because that was my role as the second oldest, right? My
And so
role was to fill the
practically
gap.
what did that look like? So 5:30 rolls around. You mentioned that 5 p.m. rolls around. It sounds like your mom was really actually good about, not drinking during the day. And what would you end up doing? So it sounds like you were sort of parentified.
It was probably mostly just interacting and engaging. I think the biggest thing, and some of these things we don't always remember, I was a peacemaker, right? If there was a conflict, because to some degree the kids were now just like, doing their thing. If
Yeah,
there was
yeah.
a conflict, I was more of a peacemaker. I would, I would, I would resolve conflicts. And interestingly, what I've been very good in my professional career is resolving conflicts.
Okay. So it sounds like you were, if your siblings started to fight or something and it was 6 p.m., you would go and break it up, or like, okay, now it's your
Right.
turn. Now it's your
Oh,
turn.
it's okay. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd resolve conflicts. Yeah.
And so you ended up just kind of going back a little bit to your professional. Can I think for a second?
Yeah.
This is great, Dan. Dude, you're a pile of wisdom. Um, so you broke away from the home. You kind of mentioned that the getting away from that environmental stimulus was really important to you. You ended up finishing college, and what happened after that?
Um, so let's see. So after college, I went and moved to Boston, got a job at this company, MITRE. I used my computer degree. Um, uh, and I went there because I had three good friends that were living there. And I chose Boston. I didn't have a job in Boston. I just chose Boston. In fact, one thing that I've often done in my life is the choices I've made have been more about where I want to live than what I want to do. And then I'd figure out what I want to do when I went and got my PhD in Austin, because I lived in Boston for 4 years, worked at this company, had a bunch of good friends, really enjoyed it, and it was really when I was in college, a big thing that helped me was I ended up joining this living group. It wasn't a frat, but it had some of the similar characteristics, not in terms of the negative thing, in terms of just having a group of people that I was accepted by, right? And I think all of us are yearning for that sense of connection and that sense of community, which as humans, we are biologically, designed to yearn for. And I found it in college with my living group, where I had a group that, I was accepted for who I was. And I think that was very instrumental in my own development. And then I found a group of friends in Boston, and I was working at this company, MITRE. But again, my life wasn't determined by my work. I chose where I was going to live first. When I moved to Austin, it's because I wanted to live in Austin when I went and got my PhD. Um, and it's interesting as I think about my life, um, really, I did a lot of development in college and in those first 4 years in Boston in terms of having a strong friend group. When I went to Austin, I had a strong friend group, but I've always had lots of friends, but it wasn't like since then, I haven't had that sort of like strong friend group that I was always spending time with as I had kids, running around my wife and the kids. And that's where been the focal of my life since, that point. But up until that point, I always had this kind of strong friend group, and that was really what drove much of what I was doing.
So this sounds very mysterious to me. This sounds fictional. This whole idea of moving to a new place and then making friends. So
Yeah.
how do you like literally, like, what are the steps to moving to a new place and making
You
friends?
know, I will tell you so again, when I moved to Boston, I moved to live with three friends I already had.
Okay.
And they were already living there. So then making friends was easy. Okay. And I've thought a lot about this whole problem of making friends, because actually I think finding a streamer on Twitch is like finding friends. One of the phrases I use all the time is uh, deep, meaningful relationships come from light, shallow interactions repeated over a short period of time. And I'll come back to that because I wasn't conscious. Like, when I moved to Boston, I just knew I wanted to live with friends. And then I made a bunch more friends. When I moved to Austin, I didn't understand this, but I was lucky that it just so happened that a friend that I had lived with in Boston, because I was in the computer science program, and I don't like, I'm not like a computer guy socially in terms of the things I do. I played a lot of basketball. I was very active. It just like, I had friends in the computer science department, but I didn't have like a strong friend group. But he moved there a year later. I ended up being really good friends with the group of, played basketball with them all the time, a group of like 5 or 6 that I'm still good friends with, that all went to business school while I was getting my PhD in computer science. So I just lucked into a friend group in Austin.
Yeah, so that's what I'm curious about. When you say you played basketball all the time, how does the first basketball game happen?
That's the beauty of basketball. The first basketball game happens because basketball happens to be a sport where pickup is common.
I see. Okay.
And so the
that's
first
really
basketball
important.
game, it is very important that, in fact, basketball is one of those games, one of the very first times in Texas, I just went and played pickup basketball for 2.5 hours, right? And the thing about basketball, and I find this, in fact, I'm going to make a suggestion for people looking for, I'm going to go ahead and abstract some of my thoughts on this, okay? In terms of, your listeners, in terms of how do I do this, okay? And I'm going to go back to the phrase I used. Deep, meaningful friendships comes from light, shallow interactions over a condensed period of time. Okay. I think one reason so many people make their best friends in college is because they're people that are looking for connection. They live in the same place, and you run into the same people a lot over time. And one of the problems that happens in our lives, especially in big cities, is you might meet somebody and say, oh, they were kind of interesting. But then you don't run into them again, like possibly ever, or for 3 months, or for 4 months, or for 5 months. Okay? And it's awkward the first time you meet someone to say, oh, let's go have dinner together. I'm not talking about a relationship here. It's just a friend. You meet a guy that you're not going to say, great, let's go have dinner.
I mean,
it's like,
that's what makes it extra awkward, is no one knows if you're looking for a relationship or not, right?
Right. Especially just a friendship, right? You know, it's like, let's go have dinner. Well, that's kind of strange. This guy asked me for dinner. What's up with that, right? And so you don't do that, right? And so, and like, if you meet somebody one time, you don't go, well, let's go have a beer together, right? And so place yourself in a situation where you are seeing some of the same people in a more condensed, where you're running into them. Like an example, actually, interestingly, this does happen in basketball as a sport, because basketball, there's a common practice of sitting and playing pickup. And one of my fondest memories of Texas was sitting next to the course, just talking to the people I would see there every day. And I have all these people that I would just see them every day, and we would become friends, and we'd play basketball together, but then we would lose. And then we'd go sit on the sidelines, okay? And we'd talk. Okay. And the fact that in basketball you lose and go sit on the sidelines and talk I built friendships.
Yeah.
Whereas that's not, every sport isn't like this. One of the sports, I want to jump in, because one of the sports I think is like this, that I always tell people that are looking for friends to consider if it works for them, is climbing, rock climbing in a gym. Because you climb and then you rest. My son got into it, and I realized it was the same thing, because when you're resting, you're just sitting there. And you start talking to someone else who's climbing. And then you start talking about climbing initially. But next thing you know, you're talking about something else. And it's because there's an activity you share, but then there's time when you're not doing that activity. So I've always think climbing is a good social sport.
Yeah, I think it's spot on, and I think your observations, it's interesting, because as part of what we try to do is help people socialize. And so I was looking at the science of like how friendships are formed, and your instinct is like literally spot on. So friendships, contrary to popular belief, are not really about shared interests necessarily, technically, right? We don't have to like the same movies or anything like that. The two things that you need are unplanned, repeated interactions. So there can't be any pressure to the interaction, right?
Yes.
I am showing up and you are showing up and we are both here, and you need repetition.
Yes.
Oh, there's an echo? Okay. Saved. Fixed? I don't know what happened there. Okay. So so you need unplanned repeated interactions. And the second thing you need is some kind of common cause. So it's not that you have to share particular interests. It's that you ideally you have a goal that's shared. So if you look at something like school, right? I show up every day. I'm a creature of habit. The environment gives me stimuli. I sit in the same spot. Other people sit in the same spot. And over time, I run into these people and there's no pressure. And then eventually what happens, okay, we all have a test next week. Hey, we have this common goal that we can move towards. In your case, it's, hey, we're on a team together and we're literally playing for victory or loss. So common cause and repeated unplanned interactions. And it's so interesting because I think this is where stuff like gaming actually is like, I think a lot of people get confused why gaming is different. And the problem with gaming is when you play a pub and you join matchmaking, you're never going to see these people again. Right? So it's great in the sense that, sure, the 5 of us are going for this goal, but then I'm never going to see this person again. And one of the things that I think leads to a lot of toxicity in gaming is the fact that we're never going to see this person again. All 5 of us are on the same team. We all want to win. But since I'm never going to see you again, I can engage in toxic behaviors. And then there's no feedback mechanism. There's no accountability for your behavior. I think one of the challenges that people face today is that these opportunities for repeated unplanned interactions are disappearing. Yes. And if you say something like, even basketball and climbing is like hard to do. I don't mean just from a physical standpoint. I mean from a time standpoint, from a geography standpoint.
You have to have a gym that's close to you. Yeah. And if you don't have a gym that's close to you, it has to. And so, yes, it's like some people are in a situation where they can do it. Many people, it's like, well, it's a 30-minute drive to the climbing gym. Yeah. And then you're not going to do it.
And at the same time, it's still interesting to hear from you that, okay, so even if there are some environmental challenges, we still sort of know that this formula works. And I think there are a couple of steps in the middle that I think people would still be surprised about. You play games. I mean, you play with them and then you become friends, and people are like, "How does that happen?" But how does that happen? Well,
yeah. Let me add another dimension that you're saying, because I agree with you about the shared purpose or shared goal, and the intensity of the experience can allow it to happen in a shorter period of time. Okay, and the intensity of the goal, and you see that with boot camp. Because you have an 8-week boot camp or 12-week boot camp. My son experienced that when he went to wilderness therapy, which was a 12-week, but he has this one friend that he's still good friends with. And they had that, and it was only 12 weeks, and then they lived, thousands of miles apart. But in 12 weeks, and that's because of the intensity of the experience and the shared goal and the shared thing. And so the more intense, then the less amount of time it takes to build that bond.
Yeah, so that too is a really interesting observation, which is research backed. So I was now looking at a different set of research about romance. So one of the things that oftentimes happens is that people, especially like online dating, is kind of a mess right now. And what a lot of times happens is it feels a little bit like a job, or not a little bit, a lot like a job interview, where it's like, these are my criteria, these are your criteria, does it match? And it turns out, so I was looking at the science of love. And love is, the interesting thing about love is that, like, we fall in love with the wrong people, right? We don't fall in love. Love is not like an intellectual exercise, like, here are the application requirements, here's what your resume says, is this fit? Okay, fine, you're hired. No, love is actually quite the opposite. And one of the key things, this is one of my favorite studies, is that a big part of forming bonds with other people, especially romantic bonds, is shared emotional experience. So they did a really fascinating study where they had couples go on first dates. Not even couples. They had people go on first dates. And they met in one of two places: a stable stone bridge or a rickety wooden bridge. And what they found is that the couples that met on the rickety wooden bridge formed a more powerful connection because both of them shared some degree of fear and anxiety.
The angst, yes, the angst. Angst and uncertainty, yes.
Human beings bond when we both feel the same thing, we bond.
Yes.
And even if we look at a platform like Twitch, I've noticed that one of the most powerful things on the platform is a shared emotional experience between whatever is happening on the screen and what's happening in chat. So my favorite example of this is when people say that they feel personally attacked. I know I'm doing a good job. So when I'm describing a particular pattern of behavior and people are like, I feel personally attacked, that's when I know I'm making an emotional connection, and that's where the magic is happening. So it's and it's interesting. I was also looking at research on boot camp and the psychology of boot camp and grit and resilience. So that's you're spot on, and I think that a lot of people. This is also why socialization is so hard, because oftentimes when we socialize, and especially if you have social anxiety, the reason that even if you go 15 times, you won't make friends is because you do not share the emotional experience of the people that you're socializing with. You are going there feeling anxious. They are going there and having a good time. Y'all are both disconnected from each other. So you kind of go, and then this is where socially anxious people sort of like, they'll have this experience where like, this doesn't work. And there are other people who are like, oh, just put yourself out there. You just got to keep at it. You got to keep at it. You got to keep at it. And that works if you're someone who can go to a social situation and feel relaxed and have a good time.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, what you should probably do if you're socially anxious is hang out with other people who are socially anxious.
Yes.
And then both of y'all will be anxious.
Interestingly, this is one of the things that is kind of special about Twitch, is that people find their communities, and their communities are so different. And what I love about TwitchCon is you see these people, you see the colors, you see all the, and they're feeling like they, belong. And when you said, oh, go find other people that have that similar experience, because when somebody else is emotionally in a very different place, right, it's not the same. And it's interesting. A lot of times people ask me about different things like I do. Oh, how did you learn to do this? And I'm very aware. I say, to be honest, this just happens naturally for me. And I'm the worst person to teach you how to do this.
Yeah.
Because someone who's socially awkward saying, well, how do you? And the answer is, well, I'm not socially awkward and it's easy. And so I've never experienced what you have to do. And so I am actually not a good person to tell you how to deal with this. And it's best to find someone who has had to deal with this because they understand that experience better than I do.
Yeah, I think well said. I think it's very I think that's a very what's the word I'm looking for? Empathic perspective, where you kind of acknowledge that, hey, like this has been easy for me. And I think this also leans into some of what you were saying earlier about challenges and dysfunction and stuff like that. This is a particular set of challenges that you haven't really had to struggle with. You've had your fair share and maybe objectively less than other people, but this is something that thankfully has never really been too much of a problem for you.
Right.
So can we kind of go back to, you mentioned you're the person who stays, and you shared that story about not staying back in your freshman year. And then you alluded to next door at some point. What does that have to do with being the one who stays?
Well, I don't want to, I will be abstract, but there is an environment where I worked closely with the CEO who, he and I worked very closely together and did a lot of good things together. He also had certain challenges in terms of how he, related with people. He thrashed people, certain behaviors that actually, I don't think in the end was healthy for the company. Okay. And he would have certain, as with so many people, he has these so many wonderful characteristics, but then he had these weaknesses, right? And at times he'd thrash out at people, and it was very hard on people in the company. And I was, again, the peacemaker. Okay. I was the one that created order in the disorder. Okay. And then he would listen to me because in general, he was very smart and he would think very quickly, and other people wouldn't feel like they could get him to change his mind. But I could change his mind because I had the same, kind of type A intellectual argument. His brain thought very fast. My brain thinks fast. So if we were in a conversation, I could go back and forth. And he respected everything I said, and he would listen to me, and I could change his mind. Most of the other people couldn't change his mind. Okay. So then I was the one they'd come to get like, we need to, well, I think we should do this. And I'd talk to them, and then I would go and work with him. But I was enabling a certain type of behavior. Okay. And it allowed that we did a lot of good stuff, but it also limited us, interestingly. Okay. Um,
Can
and
you share a little
eventually,
bit more about like what ended up getting enabled and how did it limit you?
um, that what ended up getting enabled was that some of this behavior that shouldn't have been okay with certain people, like because he'd get upset about something and he'd yell at someone, or someone would feel diminished, right? Because sometimes in a conflict, if there was a conflict, sometimes as opposed to going after the idea, he would say things that would make the person feel less. One of the challenges is always, you may have an idea that I don't like. I should focus on the idea and not say things about you, because then that's about you, not about the idea that you're trying to promote. And so there were certain behaviors that were just like shouldn't have been okay, but I would compensate and make it. And if I wasn't there, eventually
Right.
the
It would
place
have,
wouldn't have,
yeah,
it
it
wouldn't have
would have been
functioned.
unsustainable and require change.
Right, right. And then the board would have had to do something, or somebody would have, but because I was there, then I did enable a certain type of behavior, right? Because it allowed him to do this while still allowing us to realize success. Okay. And again, I want to emphasize, because it's although I doubt that like this will be clipped hit ever here, I want to say, um, he like a tremendous number of skills, right? We worked really closely together. It was only towards the end that I started to realize, no, like I didn't fully understand. And at times other people say, oh, well, Dan, you should go somewhere else, right? Because I'd be frustrated about this or that. And a friend would say, well, Dan, why don't you leave? And all these people depended upon me because I had so many good friends there, right? And this idea of me like leaving, I was like, well, like, no, I was committed. Like this ability, as opposed to, whereas other people might have gotten in this environment and after a year would have said, oh, I'm not staying for this. I'm going to go find another job. Right. But I didn't.
Catholic
Right.
guilt.
Yeah. Yes. That like that same type of I stay. Right. And I stayed. Right. And I, kept pushing because I was committed to the mission of the company. But more importantly, I was committed to the people that worked for me. Right. Because I was running all the product and engineering. I had a large team. And like I was not gonna, and they depended upon me for their, you know, and eventually it ended up falling apart, as is often like the case. These things that are like work for a while
Mm,
can't work forever. Right?
Band-aids, but
Yep.
not.
Yep.
And so Dan, let me ask you, what? So I've got a couple of different directions that I feel like we could take things. And
Yeah.
does another? How much time do you have, by the way?
So I have at 12:15, which I think is more, and in fact, even then, I think this Swedish singer, Zara, was going to pop in and Christmas Carol for me.
Okay.
Um, but
So,
so at least
what
till 12:15.
what time is it where you are now?
Oh, it's 11:10. So at
Okay.
least
So
another
about
hour.
okay. So, yeah. So
Yeah,
I think that sounds good for me. So
we have
let's
lots
try
of
to
time.
45 minutes or
And
so.
even if we were still having good times then, we'll figure out a way to let her pop in Christmas Carol for both of us, you know.
Sounds good. So let me ask you, what do you think would be a good use of our time? There are like two or three things that I'd love to ask you about. One is a little bit about, you mentioned that you've been a really solid number two, right? But now, as far as I can tell, maybe this is wrong. You're not a number two.
Right?
And so a little bit about that transition is option number one. You mentioned
Hmm.
something about, what you've learned from your son's struggles, and we want to protect his privacy and stuff. So, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, but just a little bit about, you mentioned wilderness kind of stuff, which I think that's something that I imagine our community would be very interested in hearing. And the
Yep.
third thing is that, I'm just curious about your thoughts about like what's going on with like mental health in the world today.
Yeah,
So
I
which of
mean,
these three
we should
threads?
let me suggest this. I think the first two are really good, and we should possibly go into them. But like we absolutely should talk about the third in terms of social media, mental health, because the world is different now, and what is happening in mental health in the world today. Because for many people listening to this, that's something that is important to them. So I'd say we start with that, and then we can
Great.
come back to the other two, because the other two are interesting and they may weave into that. Like I can talk some about my son's experience in that, but I think that's the big topic that we all should be thinking about.
Sure. So let's. So what do you think? What do you think is going on with mental health in the world today?
Well, and let me say that, you and I think, both share this feeling, but we made a comment earlier where we always think things are getting worse, but in fact, it's the best time. So in fact, we suffer from that experience too. And in fact, it may be that we see these things and say, oh, this is an issue, it's getting worse, but we are playing into the same pattern. Right. Even though I think the data does support in this case that there is something getting worse. But I want to be cautious because, I do know that humans have this tendency to always focus on things getting worse. But I do think the data supports it is getting worse. So.
Yeah. So can I just respond to that real quick? Because I agree.
Yeah.
I think we're on the same page here. So one of the things that I've sort of learned, both as a medical professional and just in life in general, is that acknowledging that something is getting worse is very different from believing that you are powerless to stop it. So this is where there's a lot of people who don't understand acceptance. And they think acceptance means, okay, once I accept it, that's the way it is, right? Actually, quite the opposite. The first step to changing is acceptance.
Yeah.
We have to all agree with where we are right now, and then you can go somewhere. So I see this first and foremost in addiction treatment, where until someone accepts that there is a problem, there will never be change. Yeah. So people think that acceptance means resignation. People think acceptance means I have to accept it. It's going to stay that way for the rest of my life. In fact, quite the opposite. The first step to change is actually accepting where you are.
Yep.
And in that sense, I think that is mental health objectively getting worse? I think we have plenty of data to support that. And at the same time, I'm not hopeless. I'm far from hopeless. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm very optimistic because I think we actually have in our disposal the very same tools that are making the world a bad place from a mental health.
The same tools that can solve the problem.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And
in fact, the problem that so often people think is, oh, we have to get rid of this tool that is causing the problem. And the reality is you can't get to that world. And instead, what you have to do is say, how can we use this technology and this capability to solve the problem, as opposed to think that you can just get rid of it.
Yeah, and I think that's what we've really the real challenge that I see, and I'm I'll ask for your opinion, is simply that these tools have kind of grown out of we don't realize what we were doing, and now we've gotten pretty far. And so I think that these tools have not really been leveraged in a way for positivity. And I'd actually I think Twitch is a good example of, in some ways, the opposite of that. So I started streaming on Twitch. And the reason I started streaming on Twitch was because I wanted to help more people than I could in my office. And I felt like if I just sit in my office and I see 32 patients a week, there's no way that the world is going to shift even 1%. And and through some of these platforms, which can have negative health impacts, we can actually see positive health impacts as well. But I'd love to hear kind of your take. What do you think is getting worse?
Yeah, I'll start. By the way, I'll start by recommending to everyone here a book I read that I really liked, that formed some of my thinking on this, and then we'll branch off. It's called Lost Connections by Johann Hari. And for those people in chat, the thing I loved about this book is it talks about, goes through a lot of the research on mental health and some of the challenges, and Johann suffered from depression. And the theme is that that he saw when he looked at the research was saying the big source was lost connections to various things, lost connections to people and friendships, right? Lost connections to meaningful work and agency and purpose in life, lost connections to nature and the natural world that we live in. So the interesting thing is, I think, and he had 9, I don't remember all 9. But I thought he said it very well. And so I think what is happening is, and we look for one thing, but often it's many things. Okay. And the data you and I are both referring to, I should have brought the chart. There's a chart that, oh God, now I'm going, Jonathan Haidt uses in his work. He has a book coming out called The Anxious Generation that shows the incidence of depression and anxiety, and there's this sharp decline starting in 2010. And in fact, there's a great blog post that goes through all the other reasons people have seemed to suggest this. Okay, but the overriding thing that is consistent with this, and also with queries to questions like, do you feel connected to life? How do you feel? It's not just about mental health. It's also about the sense of identity and sense of self-worth. And you see this marked decline starting around 2010, and it's more acute in women than in men, in girls and boys. And it's particularly acute with younger generations. And the thing that is overwhelmingly consistent with this is 2010 was the rise of mobile phones and social networking, right? And I completely think, and for any adult, we know how tied to this thing we are, right? And now think of being a 13-year-old or think of being an 8-year-old and your brain not fully developed, right? And it exploits. I'll try to explain. I'm sure you've talked with your community about this a lot, but I'll talk about social media. And by the way, gaming does the same thing. Has taking knowledge about how humans work in terms of yearning for social connection and validation, and of course, integrate that into how the technology works, right? So that you feel good about you feel good, how many people are watching me, and we are driven by numbers, but numbers actually don't bring happiness. But we feel like, oh wow, I got 400, likes today. I'll look, even as we're sitting here, I glanced to see, oh, what is my ACCV for this show, right? And it's 472, and I felt, oh well, good, because normally my ACC is like 250 or 275 or something like that. And so we feel good about numbers. And now think about a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, an 11-year-old, a 13-year-old. And they're looking for acceptance. They're looking for belonging. They're looking for community. They're looking for love. That's what we evolved to look for. We're looking to find our tribe, find people that care about us. And we do that through interaction with people and through lots of interaction with people. But now we're spending more time interacting with this. We're interacting asynchronously, because much of this, for those who don't know, when I say asynchronously, we're not sharing at the same moment. Interestingly, the Twitch interaction is synchronous, where we both are actually here at the same time. For most social media, the interaction is asynchronous, which is actually not how we evolved as human beings, right? And you don't have that same connection. And so then we feel, and of course we have the whole issue of the idealized version of ourselves, right? Because so much of it is photo based, right? And we feel like we are like, this is a sign of my success or acceptance, right? And that can sometimes then lead, for some, not for everyone. The thing that's interesting about this, it's not saying everyone experiences this. The point is, some people experience it, and more people, the more vulnerable people that have not had the support, have not had whatever the reasons are, feel more isolated, feel more alone, right? And are yearning for more connection, because as human beings, we are evolved to live socially with other human beings. And before I hand off for you to, take us in all sorts of questions, when I talked about this lost connections, we did not evolve to live in boxes where the whole world was excluded. We evolved in villages, right? We evolved in villages where you would have, and in that villages, there was acceptance, because the very nature of a village was you're accepted and contained and cared for with who you are. And of course, those communities were 60, 80, 100, something like that. And you had your extended family, and then you had the village. And since we lived in villages, very little evolution has occurred. The evolution occurred for the 100,000, million years before that. And we weren't designed to live in these boxes where we were excluded from other people, where we were excluded from nature, where we were isolated and sitting in our bedroom. But the world we live in now puts us in these boxes, separated from other human beings for most of our day, right? And that's not what humans are. Humans are not supposed to be separated from other human beings for most of their experience. We should be connected with other human beings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's so. So a couple of things to kind of just bounce off of what you said, or build off of what you said. The first is when you mentioned, like, we were designed to live in tribes and or like villages, and in the village there's acceptance. I would even, in a sense, completely agree with you, but say that there's an important nuance there. So I think the biggest thing that the village allowed us, it's not that the village accepted us. It's that a village offered a very structured way to move from unacceptance to acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get ostracized by the village, and I've sort of seen this with like the relationship that we have with our emotions, where we think that there's positive emotions and negative emotions. And this is kind of our experience of them, because some emotions are associated with suffering. And obviously, like, intellectually, we can say, okay, all emotions, there's no such thing as a good emotion or bad emotion. They all serve a purpose. That's fine intellectually, academically, neuroscientifically, whatever. But if you look at where the rubber meets the road, if you look at people's experience, there are emotions that are bad and there are emotions that are good. I think the biggest problem that has changed in terms of the village is that in the village setting, the negative emotion serves a positive function. So if we talk about something like guilt, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole reason that we feel guilt is that when we feel guilt, it induces us to conformist behavior.
To behavior a certain way. Yep.
Right? And then once we behave the way, that moves us. So let's say I stole something. The village does not accept this. They ostracize me. They make me feel guilty. I say I'm never going to steal again. I do whatever. And then the village says, okay, fine. Now that you've corrected this behavior, we will accept you again. Yep. Now the problem is that when we feel guilt or shame, when we're looking at some social media post and we feel shame because someone is more ripped than I am or has more likes than I do, take whatever your pick is. Normally, that was used as fuel for corrective action, right? So if I go out hunting with the tribe and then 15 people are able to jog and I'm huffing and puffing and I'm not able to jog, I feel shameful about my physical state, and that will induce me towards corrective behaviors. Right now, what's going on is, and as you kind of alluded to, I think people sort of figured out how to trigger these emotions. And what we sort of figured out, I don't know if you guys know this, I don't know if you guys even know this consciously, even on platforms like Twitch. My experience has been that many platforms are not quite as conscious of this, in the sense that you've got a product manager, a product developer who's looking at this particular metric. They have this particular target they have to hit. I don't know that they're thinking about the psychological implications of what they're doing.
They certainly are not.
And that too, I know a lot of people will demonize platforms, but in my experience, platforms have hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals that are each moving one grain of sand, and that's what they're sort of focused on. And then the end effect is something that is far more emergent than you can see kind of at the individual level. But the problem right now is that we experience all of these negative emotions, and that there's nowhere for these negative emotions to move us in the right way. Right. Mm-hmm. So if I feel ashamed because there are professional influencers across my social media feeds who have certain body types and whatnot, there's no corrective action that I can take. So then the negative emotion truly becomes negative, because that positivity, the opportunity for positivity, has been removed.
And also note, the corrective action is huge. But the corrective action, the interesting thing is, it sometimes, because you're not keeping up with the tribe, right? Then you feel like, okay, there's a corrective action that you can take to keep up with the tribe. Okay. Interestingly, for so many people, they actually are keeping up with the tribe. Okay. But if they're all running on a hunt, whoever's in front versus in fourth, because the reality is they're all on the hunt, right? And they all work together as a team, okay? And yes, there probably is one that is the best hunter, okay? But then there are other ones that play their part in the hunting, right? And they say valued, so they don't feel like they need to be the best hunter, because there's a shared purpose in a team, and they are going out and they accomplish their goal together, okay? And they are a group. Yet so often, now we are individuals, and we are not this shared experience. And so, in fact, the third person now feels some degree of shame.
Yeah.
Okay, because they are, and they actually should not feel any shame. Okay, but the fact that they're, and now it's not the third, because there's always someone who's going to have more likes, who's going to be prettier, who's, so this person who actually like is like has so many skills feels that same emotion and lack of acceptance, and so it happens throughout, and that didn't happen in the physical world.
And I like what you're saying about like being in a box and whatnot, because I think this is something we're starting to understand more and more. I think that Eastern medicine has sort of understood this for a long time.
Hmm.
We're sort of now realizing it in the West. But if you look at the evolution of how we understand psychiatry and the mind, we think about the mind as an organ. And this is in the context of the mind being an organ, just like the heart, just like the kidneys, just like the liver. The biggest thing that's different about the mind is that every other organ in our body can be healthy within the body or unhealthy within the body, right? So like my liver can be like healthy or unhealthy. If I drink alcohol, it'll be unhealthy. If I don't drink
Yep.
alcohol, it'll be healthy. The mind is the only organ of the body that requires other people or external things to be healthy.
Yep. Yep.
So it
Yep.
is the only organ of the body. And this is, I think, a big problem that's happening right now is that if we look at something like the loneliness epidemic, and we get this question 1,000 times, and I've done my best to answer it. How do I connect to other people? The real problem here is that you can do nothing to connect to other people. Your loneliness cannot be fixed by you. Your loneliness has to be fixed by someone else. And as our society has moved towards individuality, living within a box, and independence, really, this is a consequence. I'm not saying independence is bad, but as I start to live a life where I can get grocery delivery, I can get food delivery, I can get my entertainment delivered through the internet, I can work remotely, we are becoming more and more independent, right? This is the goal that we've been moving towards, that you should be beholden to no one. You should be able to do whatever you want to. You should be able to craft the life that you want to, which is totally good. It's very good that we move towards that. There's a consequence, though, right? So as we've moved in this direction, as we become more independent, we're beholden to no one, right? This is why if we see this, like I see this a lot on the internet, where a lot of people will sort of say like, okay, like go low contact or no contact with toxic people. Block them, right? It's so easy to block people. And then I'll also see a lot of people who will get very, very offended that even their therapist recommends repairing relationships instead of cutting people out of their life. And they'll say, oh my God, my therapist said that I should try to forgive this person. And then the internet will be like, oh my God, you should find a different therapist. And so what's happening is as we become independent and we are beholden to no one else, right? Because it's my life, I get to do what I want with it. Okay, so let's play that tape through to the end. If it's your life and you get to do what you want with it, then everybody else, it's their life and they get to do what they want with it, right? And then what we end up with is loneliness because no one gives two fucks about you and you don't give two fucks about anyone else. And then like, what do you expect? So I think this is a big thing that we've misunderstood.
Yeah, interestingly, that as you talk about this, it reminded me of something that my son said to me that I thought was incredibly prophetic, and I think it was in seventh grade. And you talked about this or as you were going through this, you talked about connecting with those people that are in the same, to some degree, share the same emotional state or experience that we are in at that, because then we have a shared emotional experience, right? And so he had gone to a Waldorf school. For those who don't know, Waldorf school is a particular type of school that they tend to be small. You're in the same group with everyone. But we switched him to a public school in, I think it was fifth grade, because he was having some trouble reading and it was just the right thing. And so now he was in the public school, and now he had always played a lot of organized sports. So I coached him in basketball and baseball and soccer. So he knew all the neighborhood kids, right? And he knew them from sports. And he was not like a star, but he was a pretty good, pretty good at those things. And, in general, we know how kids, like when you're good at sports, they like that sports is a big part of the social interactions, right?
Yeah.
So he was going to public school, and he was not finding his tribe in the school. He had friends, but he wasn't finding his tribe, where those friends that he was just accepted for who he was, okay, that he could just go to lunch and hang out with and not be a little on edge, right? And he started to have this anxiety, right? He started to have like this strong, lots of stomach pain, where it was very acute initially. We thought we thought he had some type of bug, and we talked to him because his stomach would hurt, horribly. And he couldn't go to school, and we thought he had something going on, and we brought him to the doctor, and that wasn't it. And then we realized it was anxiety because it went away on the weekend, and then it came back on Monday, right? And we weren't putting academic pressure on him. And at some point during all of this journey, he had said to me, "Dad, you know what I realized? People who aren't popular with the cool kids are lucky." He said, "I'm kind of friends with with kind of the in groups. And so I kind of hang out with them, but I'm not really their friend." Because he just wasn't fully their friend, but he was on the fringe. But so he always felt sort of excluded, but he was kind of included but excluded. And then he said, people that aren't popular with the popular kids, they just find their friends and they're happy. But I have been trying, and now I'm adding a little bit. I have been trying to be in with the in group, as opposed to just finding my friends and being happy. And then he let himself be friends. It was actually someone he gamed with, this kid. He was an Indian kid that lived down the street that then he would go over to his house, and he had a lot of fun with him. And he wasn't one of the popular kids in high school, right? And of course, often the popular kids tend to be more athletic because that's the nature of schools, right? And since he was a good baseball player and a good basketball player, and they'd accept him, right? And but then he let go of that, and he was so much happier, and he realized it, right? And the statement that says, he actually said, people that aren't in with the pot are lucky because they find their friends, and then they're just happy with their friends, and they don't try to be. And I think one of the challenges that so many people is, you try to be this other person. You try to be in this group. You try to be accepted here. You try to be in with that. And as human beings, we just need to be accepted and loved and appreciated for who we are. And what we need to do is find our tribe, right? And stop trying to be. And one of the challenges is with social media is you aspire to these other people, as opposed to just saying, no, like, you're here for me, I'm here for you. That's what being a tribe means.
And why do you think it is that? So what is it that allows some people to, let's say, let go of being on the fringe versus trying to climb in, right? So how do people get stuck in that zone? And that's something that, by the way, resonated with me too. I mean, it's kind of the story of my life, is that I've been at the fringe of basically every. I'm a streamer, but I'm not a real streamer. I was an academic, but not a real academic,
Right.
And even just every aspect of my life. It's like I'm 25% of this thing. Technically, I'm a part of this group, but I'm not like one of these people. These are not my people, even in terms of spirituality, where it's like, okay, like I'm sort of hardcore, but I'm not like hardcore like the real hardcore people.
Right. It's a good question. Interesting. I'm gonna divert for 1 second here and then come back to that question, because it reminded me of one thing. Some of the friends that he was on the fringe with, they were Mormons, and we did not bring him up in a religious tradition. I grew up Catholic, and I think there are all sorts of wonderful things. I also think there are lots of challenges. So we looked at churches, but I didn't believe in all the rhetoric, so I didn't. And he said, "Dad, sometimes I wish we were Mormon." And he said, because they go to church all the time and they hang out. And it was because of the community interaction that he even talked about going to the Mormon church in like 6th grade, so that he would be part of the community. And I'll say this, that, you talk about, and I know you realize this, you talk about this in your professional life, right? And I think in the professional life, that's a different world. In our personal lives, it is essential that we find people that care about our existence, that care that we exist, right? And then that we care that they exist, right? and we need to let go of this status, right? About wanting to be with that group or that group and all that, right? Now in a professional world, that's a little different, but but in a personal world, it's this sense of letting go and realizing we're all in this, like, in this life, and just finding that group. And that is part of the magic of Twitch. Twitch is also a limiting factor, but one of the magical things about Twitch is the fact that there are these people that feel alone, right? For whatever reason, right? Maybe they're trans and they feel ostracized, and it may be within their physical environment. There actually is not a lot of people. It's hard to find those people that will accept them, right? And that certainly would be the case if you take, someone who's 15, trans, they haven't come out, they haven't yet they find a group on Twitch where they can be accepted, where they can be who they are. And sometimes they end up streaming as, like, that's one of the beautiful things about VTubing, I find, is sometimes what happens with VTubing. And I know one that like, they can become this person they want to be in this virtual world, right? That they can't fully realize in the physical world, right? And so I think there's something wonderful about finding your tribe, okay? And now the only limiting factor of Twitch is it's virtual. And that, in fact, in the end, we need physical interaction too. And so it's wonderful that you can find that tribe. But as you find that tribe online, then you have to know that there are tribes you can find physically, because we need face-to-face interaction. So, and of course, finding the tribe online can cause you not to seek and push yourself to find that face-to-face
that's the rub, right? So I think that's what I also struggle with. I'm glad you kind of brought that up. So when I think about this person who is not accepted and becomes a VTuber, and we've worked with a fair number of VTubers. So there's a part of that I think is absolutely beautiful and wonderful, because this is someone who's starving for something, and we're at least giving them something. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I think that what I still struggle with is, like, even when we think about the HG community, we try to provide a sense of community. And at the same time, we may be enabling people to remain isolated.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So now we've given you something. We can't give you a hug, but we can give you intellectual stimulation. We can give you someone to hang out with, someone to clean your room with, someone to do this with, someone to do that with. And we've had a couple of really awesome community challenges where we had this Touch Grass campaign where, I want to say 10 to 20,000 people went out and did things.
Yes.
Right? Like go and meditate in a park, in a park with a friend. Yes. And at the same time, we can't do it all. And so I really struggle with trying to figure out, okay, like, because I'll say this, and sometimes people get upset. The goal of our community is for you to no longer need it. That's what we're here for. We should be a stepping stone, not a home. I'm reevaluating that myself, because people have told us, hey, like, I don't want to leave. And even if I'm building my life, I still find that this is a good place. Like, this helps me build my life.
Well, actually, I will say this in terms of, as you say, a stepping stone where you don't need it. And in fact, I'd be curious how you can work this in, because of course all sorts of psychological research showing that the best way we learn something is actually by helping someone else, right? And by coaching rather than doing it ourselves, right? And then in coaching, we learn more from ourselves. Yep. So the interesting question is those people that they don't need it, but then they need it because eventually they can be giving back to the community. And so now they still need it. But they don't need it because the reality is if it was taken away, they could not be happy. No, they actually could still be happy if suddenly something happened and it got taken away. But they can be happier by remaining part of the community, but now being able to give back to help other people along that journey, because in that sense, they even understand it even more.
That's a really good point. And I think that's what we see very practically.
Yeah.
Is that people who do kind of come and give back, and that there's a value to that. Even when I sort of think about my role in the community, theoretically giving back is most of what I do.
Yeah.
And that's very beneficial to me. So yeah, so
Maybe
Dan,
it's the difference between needing it or wanting it. They go from needing it, and then they eventually get to where they want it, so they still do it, but
yeah,
they don't need it. They
I
don't
think
need it.
I think that's a fair distinction or nuance about sort of like the independence versus being dependent on it, and
Yes.
still finding value in it even if you don't need it.
Yeah.
So what do you think? We've got maybe about 10 minutes left. What do you want to kind of touch on? Anything? I haven't given you a chance to ask questions or anything like that. Do you have any like thoughts or questions that you want to ask?
No, no, no. Let's just keep going.
Okay.
This is a good. In fact, actually, the thing we were going on, which I think is, I really do struggle with, and you talking about, and you talked about touching grass, um, uh, um, meeting other people, right? I cannot. There's a and Susan Pinker wrote a book that, and one of the things that she talks about in there, going through a lot of research, is saying how important face-to-face interaction is. And in fact, one of the things she claims, and I can't assert that this is that her science is necessarily right, but it says that face-to-face interaction is critical to longevity and health. And in fact, she says it has the equivalent positive impact as not smoking has in terms of the positive impact. So the example she uses: suppose you have somebody that has a bunch of friends, and but they're a chain smoker, and they have to choose between not smoking
Hmm.
but not being with their friends, or continuing to smoke. Which path will cause them to live longer? And most people will think, oh, well, they should stop smoking and find new friends. Of course, this is hypothesizing they don't necessarily find that same friendship of face to face. And they said the positive impact of smoking, not smoking, is about the same, the opposite of
Yeah.
the importance of face to face interaction. And that, at least again, her claim is virtual connection doesn't have the same physiological effect in terms of the oxytocin. Now, I don't think she was necessarily looking at Twitch, but I can believe this is the case, that in fact, there are certain things that we evolved with the biology in our body. And of course, right now we are staring at a screen. We're experiencing the emotions the same, but our eyes are staring at a screen. Everything. And the claim was that virtual connections don't have the same physiological impact in terms of longevity as face-to-face interactions. And so I strongly encourage, I do think, and I don't have the answer, right, that the virtual interactions are wonderful, and continually, because I think, and you talk about touching grass, and I'd say touching grass and touching grass with other people, that is the foundation of what it means to be a human, is touching grass with other people. And I'll add the third thing, which I'll say is agency and purpose. Touching grass with
So
other people with some agency and purpose.
I see that you are a true content creator in this moment, because you said touching grass. You said touching grass with other people, but
Yeah.
you did not say touching other people.
No, I did not.
Which is actually a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
But I can see your sensitivity to being clipped, because if
Actually,
you
I
had said
wasn't thinking. No, it is fair. No, by the way, I wasn't thinking, oh, stay away from touching other people. Yes, but the interesting thing is, touching other people has different meanings. Okay. There's, of course, having a physical relationship with someone. Okay, which is a fundamental part of. But I actually think there is a physical, as in a sexual relationship, but then there is a physical where you hug and you touch people. And I actually think, well, obviously, having a committed and relationship with someone is really important. If you go back in time, as you talk about tribes and other things, there were probably all sorts of people in those tribes that thrived that did not end up having a committed partner, or their committed partner died, and then they didn't have a committed, they died when they're young, and then they lived for the next 40 years, right? When their committed partner was eaten by a lion. Okay. But that doesn't mean they didn't actually have touch, right?
absolutely.
From people that cared about them. And I think the foundation, we all yearn for having that committed person that we are with. But I actually think the focus on that distracts us. And we think that if we don't have that, we somehow can't be happy. Because in fact, if I would contend, if you have to choose between the two, right, having a community of people that care that you exist, okay, is the foundation. That in fact, that is what we all need, is a group of people that care that we exist. And then if you also have one person, that's wonderful too.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I think we have plenty of evidence that shows that you can actually do okay without a committed romantic partner. So you can look at places like monasteries as simple examples of this. I think the challenge is that what we feel acutely the most, right, is the lack of someone to love and someone to be loved by in our life. I think we just kind of feel that. And I think everything that you're saying is spot on. I mean, agency and purpose is huge. So even when we sort of develop our products and services, we don't shoot for particular mental health outcomes. We shoot for some of these more quality of life outcomes like agency and purpose. So if you look at the research on pornography addiction, for example, what you find is that meaninglessness is one of the top things that correlates with pornography addiction.
Yep.
So people will just watch pornography. The number one reason why people watch pornography, I mean, this is not really true technically, but is because they have a reason. They need a reason to not watch it. That's how you stop watching it. You have to have something that that is worth not watching it. And in the absence of a good reason to not watch pornography, your brain is going to fall into the dopamine and the emotional regulation and the emotional comfort that pornography, like from a stimulation standpoint, the way that it affects your eyes, the way that it affects your ears, the way it affects your physiology and brain, it just affects it. And we're sort of seeing this too in terms of like novel hypotheses around the cause of depression. So for some amount of time, as we sort of developed psychopharmacology and we became very biological, we started to really think about serotonin imbalances or serotonin deficiency. But I think we're now beginning to see that depression has a lot more to it. And that things like adverse childhood experiences, a lack of kind of direction in life, lack of purpose, lack of worth, lack of connection, all of these things will contribute to what we think of as a biological and internal process. But if I've learned anything, it's that depression is not an internal process. It is both an internal and external process.
Although I'll and you can tell me what, like, you'll know more about this. I have this instinct, okay, that we talk about one thing, okay, and how you get there and what is the process. And the reality is that one thing is many things. And in fact, so many people get there from different paths. And that in fact, there are those people that find themselves in depression where I conjecture that the physiological component of their physiological creation and their susceptibility to certain stimulus led them to sometimes very deep and dark places. I think of William Styron, who wrote a wonderful book about his suffering from depression. And then there are other people that get to it from other ways, and that the physiological things follow the social and behavioral things, and sometimes the social and behavioral things follow the physiological things. In fact, this is one thing that Johann talks in the book. He talks about the three components: psychological, physiological, and sociological. And now he doesn't say this, but my sense is different people come to this experience from different shortcomings. And for some people, it may have been dominated by a physiological issue that then manifests itself sociologically and psychologically. And other people may come to it from a different, and then it manifests itself physiologically.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment. I would tweak it in some ways. So here's one of the main things that I've understood. So we think about a human as a monolithic thing, but a human is like a web. So you have all of these different pieces that are all connected. And what we kind of know scientifically is that a strain on any part of the web, so there's a focal point. If I have, let's say, like a net, okay? And there are all these different nodes on the net. And if I drop a weight in the middle, there's one part that will sink, but everything around it will also sink. So this is what I've understood as, what little psychiatry I practiced in my life, is that some people, the original insult will be physical or emotional or relational or spiritual even. And then what happens is the other parts of our body or mind or what the other parts of our being buffer against it. So if I receive, let's say, a phone call that someone that I care about has passed away, this is a sensory stimulus that is essentially an emotional hurt. But depending on the strength of my logical mind, depending on the physiology of my body, that psychological insult will hurt more or hurt less. The other parts of me can sort of buffer against it. And even if my mind is weak and my body is weak, if I have enough people around me, if I have enough social support, that will protect against it. Similarly, if I'm ostracized by everybody, this is a social insult. Depending on the strength of my body, depending on my emotional resilience, I'm able to handle that. So the human being is actually composed of many different pieces, and the attack can come from any of these dimensions is what I would really call it, right? So it's like layers of being. And then depending on how potent the other things are, you can kind of buffer against it. And this is also where when we look at treatment, the goal of treatment is not to just fix this one thing. If you've had heartbreak, sure, one thing that you can do is start dating someone else. But there are a lot of other areas that you can kind of buffer and build up. And as you build up the different layers of self, you will become more resilient against any kind of insult. And this, I think the science is moving in this direction as well, right? So we know, for example, that certain mind-body practices, certain physical health, gut microbiome, emotional processing, touch from another human being in nature, there are all these different dimensions of self, and that essentially what happens with depression is that the number of attacks on the being outweigh the defensive capabilities.
The defenses, right, because it's always a balance. It's always a balance, and often we focus on the attacks, but it's the attacks with the defensive capabilities we have, and it becomes imbalanced. And then, of course, the problem is it feeds on itself, because the very thing that gets you out.
So that's a really great point, right? So that's the key thing. I almost think about depression is the HIV/AIDS of mental illness. So the problem with HIV and AIDS is that this is a virus that attacks our immune system, which protects us against viruses. This is why it's so devastating. It doesn't attack the body as a whole. It attacks our ability to fight back. And if I had to pick one mental illness that attacks our ability to fight back, it's depression.
Yes, and it's that and it's really brutal. In fact, what I've often said is, to the extent you end up using a physiological solution, okay, all the physiological solution is really doing is like limiting that attack to then allow you to help you a little bit to get so that the social and the psychological behaviors. And people so often don't understand how the behavior affects your physiology and the physiology affects your behavior. And that, in fact, it's a cycle. And sometimes pharmacology is a good way to break the cycle. But then so often in the treatment, that is just ignored, and they don't realize that this is, because then, in fact, Johan talks about this. So often if you don't, then you just get right back there, because you don't realize this is just giving you a little bit of a help, so that then you can stop the behavioral patterns that have been reinforcing this.
I completely agree. I mean, I think that very much mirrors my own clinical experience, is that medication doesn't fix things. Well, there are some cases in which it does.
There are certain, by the way, that's the thing. The mental health is not all one thing.
Yeah.
There are certain and especially when you move outside of depression, there are some that are very acute mental health illnesses that are heavily physiological, and that in fact the pharmacology can actually make a big difference. But that doesn't mean it's all mental health problems.
Yeah. So Dan, let me ask you, how did you learn so much about mental health? Because I mean, I was stunned when you were talking about DSM-3 and DSM-4, and I know it's not a part of this conversation, but
yeah. It's something that, it's interesting. We talk about, I talk about the boxes that we put ourselves in. And of course, people see me as being in a tech box. right? Well, I majored in computer science, but I was a liberal arts major, and I took a lot of psychology courses. Given my family, my wife's family, I've definitely then read a lot, and so there's a completely different world, right? Where I think I would have been a therapist, right?
Mm.
I find it very interesting. I find, and I've done a lot of reading about it, because I think it's so central to so much. It's interesting that I don't think I have not been someone who suffered really kind of in any way. In other words, I have been blessed in terms of my mental health and psychological health, but I've known many people that have suffered, and so that leads me to read and to understand more of what they are experiencing, and so, and that runs in my family, as well, because so often alcoholism goes hands in hand
Yeah,
with mental health challenges.
absolutely. And so
Yeah.
Dan, one kind of last question for you, and I know
And
we're
by the way, we can go. Now you may need to go, but we can go at somewhere around 12:15. Zara is going to pop in to my chat and invite me, and so we can keep going until she pops in. I don't need to, but you may want to get going on your
yeah.
channel.
So I think so I've noticed that when you pass the 2 hour mark, you
Yeah,
start rewriting your RAM.
yeah, yeah.
So I try to limit things to about 2 hours, and then because I think
Yep.
everything you've said is really awesome, and I actually have noticed that if I continue, it's because I'm enjoying it. But
Yeah,
what
I
are we
know.
here for? It's not to
It's
enjoy.
to
I mean,
help
that's a piece
people,
of
and
it.
the reality is they can't keep absorbing. If we want to spend more time, then
Yeah.
just spend more time. But 2 hours, they can't, absorb what we're saying.
I like to give myself and everyone a chance to digest and then potentially, reconnect afterward. But
Yeah.
I've got I really appreciate the offer though, and your flexibility there. Thank you so much. So one last question I've got for you, and this may be opening up a whole can of worms, and maybe this will take about 15 minutes. But so you said that you're a problem solver. The first thing that you said is I'm a problem solver. So what's the problem you're solving at Twitch
Uh, um.
or with Twitch?
Yeah, with Twitch is that is more interesting than at
Yeah.
Twitch, right? Because at Twitch, I'm talking about the internal challenges that we have as an organization. What is the problem we're solving with Twitch? So I think it fits into what we just um, uh, um, talked about. Um, uh, we talk about social networking, right? But sitting on your phone swiping actually isn't very social. It's not social at all, right? And it's very isolating, interestingly, because it gives you an excuse not to do, and it's also not about not going out. It's also, by the way, I'm going to divert for 1 second, because one of the stories I wanted to tell was a story that Johan Hari says in his book, where he was in, I think it was somewhere in the Philippines or somewhere in the South Pacific, and he talked to someone who was treating someone with depression, and the way they treated him was they gave him a cow. And they're like, gave them a cow, and it solved their depression. And why? Well, because they had to take care of the cow,
Mm-hmm.
because they had to care for the cow, and it gave them a reason. Okay. And so often when you're sitting there swiping, right, maybe you're not going out and meeting with people, but maybe you're also not doing something that gives you agency, that feels that you're contributing in a meaningful world. Okay. Um, uh, I do think that the social interaction at Twitch, as I mentioned, the synchronous interaction, is a meaningful difference, because you actually find a community. And in fact, I don't think asynchronous is a community. I think community by definition comes from shared interactions at the same time, right? It's synchronous by nature is what builds a community. Now, once you have a community, you may be able to interact on Discord or other things that still manifests that connection. Just like we may have friends and we may text them or do other things, it's not at the same time. But I do think there's something unique and special about the community that is created in channels, and that sense. And it's not just about the streamer, it's about the people that you see next to you. And in fact, I said this at TwitchCon, where I said people think of live streaming as live streaming and live streaming, and they think of all these things as kind of the same thing. and I said, us and TikTok live streaming are in the same way. A blog post and a novel are not the same thing. They both are the written word.
Hmm.
Okay. But just because they're using the same medium of communication doesn't mean they are the same thing. Okay. And the difference between Twitch versus TikTok is on TikTok, it is not a community. You're all watching someone live stream and you may find them very funny and other people are talking. But just because you are in a room where other people are talking, that doesn't mean it's a community. A community forms over time because you start recognizing the same people. You start seeing the same people. You start understanding that, and you start having what I call as horizontal interaction in chat, not just vertical interaction.
Hmm.
Like them, and when you're on a big streamer, interesting, I don't think community is a big part. It's much more vertical interaction. It's a bunch of people. It's a bunch of people yelling, which is great. It's different. Okay. But on your stream, I suspect, I don't know the size of your stream, but I suspect people get a sense they see the same people. And then where Twitch really works is on, 50 ACCV, 100 ACCV, 100, like you see the same people. And I think there's something really special and unique in that. And we're long form entertainment, but we're long form entertainment that is rooted in community. And I find that very interesting. And I did not understand that when I joined Twitch.
Hmm.
Interestingly, when I joined Twitch, because I was not a gamer, so I didn't really know Twitch. I chose Twitch because I liked the people I was going to be working with.
Hmm.
And at that point, the problem I found interesting in Twitch was different because it was, oh, we're a gaming platform. How do we grow? All these other things. But it's only since I've been at Twitch, okay, that I've found, and while you talked about karma, there's a synchronicity because, I did theater when I was younger. I am a creator at heart. There's all sorts of parts of my life where I create. I'm a technologist. I'm also someone who believes, has studied a lot about community and what creates community and the site. And interestingly, Twitch, without my planning, is able to leverage because I stream and I create, right? I use my technical and business and leadership skills, and then I use my knowledge of community and community building. And I didn't know that they were all going to come together
This
in one thing.
this sounds like the raid boss, the final boss.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much, Dan, for coming
So
on
I
today.
have an idea here. I have
Yeah.
an idea. I wasn't going to do this.
Okay.
Okay. But if you're up for it, because I agree, and now it's going to take me 2 seconds to get up and get a microphone. Okay.
Okay.
But I might end doing a song,
Sure. Let's do it.
and I'm going to end doing a song that in fact, I went back and forth whether I should do the song. Actually, no, I'm not going to do the song. I'm going to read the song as a poem.
Okay.
Okay. Because I think hearing it as a poem touches on so much that we're talking about. Okay. And
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
this
That
person
sounds awesome. We would be honored.
this person I've been listening to a lot called Jeffrey Martin. Okay. And his song is Thank God We Left the Garden. His album is Thank God We Left the Garden.
Is there some reason that you want to read it as a poem? I'm sorry, instead of a song, you think it captures it better?
I will. I think what occurs to, first of all, there's the logistics issue of getting the mic and all that. The other thing is you hear the words a little more as a poem. Okay. Although
sure.
I love singing it. I love singing it. So I
Let's
would
do it.
happily sing it if you'd rather.
No.
But let me
whatever you think is whatever you want
Yeah.
to share and whatever you think
Yeah.
would convey what you're hoping to share is we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, and but in this album, Thank God We Left the Garden, and the whole album is around this idea that actually the Garden of Eden was not paradise, because in fact there was a veil over our eyes, because in fact without sorrow there is no joy, without pain there is no happiness, and so in fact the magic of life is not the Garden of Eden. Okay? And then in fact the Garden of Eden is the suffering, the pain, everything that we experience, all the human emotions that we all experience is what makes life magical, right? And the album has a bunch of wonderful songs on it. Before I read this poem, I'm going to read one of the lines from one, since we talked about transgender people. There's one that talks about this friend of his that was gay, that when he was young, again, I don't know if he made it up, if it really was a friend, but then talks about the effect that the burden from the church about being accepted. And then the last line of the song that I love is it says, did he breathe into you just to tell you that you are to blame? And this concept that did God breathe life into you as you are today? And of course, that is just to tell you that you are to blame for who you are, right? And but now I'll go to Daylight, because the song Daylight, this is where he touches on this idea of having the veil lifted, right? So it says, standing alone. Actually, no, I'm going to sing it. It is such a good song. So let me get the microphone.
Okay, let's do it. Yeah, so he's talking about, did God breathe life into you just to blame? Well, that depends on whether God is a Twitch chatter or not. Did he show up just to troll? That's great. Now, I know, I mean, I saw that there were a couple of comments about, ask him about his artistic nudity policy and stuff like that. So let me explain something to y'all, okay? I'm not saying that those questions aren't important, but those aren't the questions we're here to ask or the things that we're here to learn, right? That's not what we exist for.
And I'll say this, they actually, and I don't know if you now are chatting with them for a while, so I don't want to draw them away. But I'll answer questions about them. I'll be streaming till 1. I'm also going to stream later tonight. I'm happy to answer those questions. But I agree. I don't think that's what this was about.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I didn't know you could hear me, but okay.
Yeah, because I had the volume going. But yeah, I agreed. Okay. All right. Now, the first thing I need to do is I have things set up. Yeah, now I just need to go into Discord. And I need to change the mic. All right. Voice and video. Input device. Can you hear me?
Yes. It sounds quieter. Okay, I'm just going to turn you up some.
Okay, turn me up. Here's the piano. I'll try to turn it up here too.
No, that's fine. I think we're okay now. Oh, can't hear you.
Now I need to change on my channel too, so 1 sec.
Okay. Yeah, and like Dan said, so he's going to be streaming. So this is also pretty cool, right? So like he streams. And y'all can ask him questions directly. Like that's pretty neat. How common is that? So if y'all want to ask him a question, y'all ask him a question.
All right, so I'm going to check on my stream. Can you hear me on my stream? Peanut butter pops, peanut butter pops. All right, here we go. And I didn't warm up singing at all, but that's okay. Standing alone with the ticket in my hand. All right, I'm going to pause. I'm going to do 2 chords, and then I'm going to pause in case there's anything going wrong.
Okay.
Standing alone with a ticket in my hand. I paid all of my money to be here. How is everything?
I think it's good. The only thing is that it's sometimes hard to hear what a word is when you're playing the piano, but I think it'll be fine. Just go for it.
No, I can solve that by turning down the piano. That's why I wanted to check.
Right, because you were saying that the lyrics were really important, so that's the only thing that I would say.
I may have turned it down too much.
Yeah,
standing alone with a ticket in my hand.
Turn up the piano just a touch, and then just go for it.
Turn it up or down?
Turn up the piano just a touch.
All right.
And then just go for it, I think.
All right, here we go. Standing alone with a ticket in my hand, I paid all of my money to be here. That's why it's taken me so damn long to ask for the help to leave here. how I imagine never comes to fruition. I got volumes of stories to spin here. The best dreams are only a sad imitation of the mysteries that cannot be seen here. All of my nights for a glimpse of the sun, all of my faith in the great unknown, all of my love to be finally shown. Whoa, daylight, won't you come? Whoa, daylight, won't you come? I'm a scoundrel at best, all the things that I've kept, all of my money to be here. The words that I write were first written by them, still I claim to have something to say. We each meet the garden as new as the first, better than the thrift to be blind here. And set into motion, we wonder the reason, and trust that there's something to find here. All of my nights for a glimpse of the sun, all of my faith in the great unknown, all of my love to be finally shown. Whoa, daylight, won't you come? Whoa, daylight, won't you come? The heavy weight of nothing out there is enough to bury me down here. This fire in my chest can't just run out of breath, leave no trace of love to be found here. Say again the things you said back then, and how there's no reason to fear here. The wind will blow, the wind will blow, don't mind me, I'm down on my knees here. All of my nights for a glimpse of the sun, all of my faith and things that I've done, all of my love to be finally shown. Whoa, daylight, won't you come? Whoa, daylight, won't you come? Whoa, daylight, won't you come? All right.
Beautiful.
Hope you enjoyed it. I had a great time chatting.
Likewise, Dan.
Happy to spend more time. You know, I was thinking maybe at some point you and I we'll just do it where we just answer questions from the audience, because
Sure.
I think, you know, this time we were going back and forth. We weren't really looking at there, and I'm sure I know part of what you do is I'm sure you respond to chat all the time.
Yeah.
And you know, be happy to do that, because I'm sure your community would have lots of questions that, you know, we didn't get to.
Dan, we're honored by your performance. It's a beautiful piece of music, and something that I plan on listening to a few more times to really catch it. But I think a lot of it comes through. My take on it is that it was a song about the insufficiency of man.
Yeah.
But beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dan. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Dr. K. Bye-bye. And I'm staying on for my chat.
All right. Well, maybe we'll raid Dan. Okay. So that was awesome. Now, like I said, yeah, so like, look, y'all got to understand this, okay? This is very important. So we talk to a lot of people on this channel. And I know a lot of these people are villains, right? We perceive them as villains. So here's what I've learned as a psychiatrist. I mean, arguably even before I was a psychiatrist, but really as a psychiatrist. The beauty of the privilege of being a medical doctor, therapist, psychiatrist, whatever, is that you have to work with everybody, right? So we take an oath that we don't get to discriminate based on religion, class, creed, whatever. So like when someone walks into the emergency room, you do not get to turn them away. This is a core aspect of my profession. And so one of the beautiful things about that is when you work with everyone, and not just reluctantly work with everyone. Everyone deserves, so we have this principle of ethics called justice, which means that everyone should receive the same, right? And so when we work in this way, one of the things that you discover is that, like, as you let go of your own hatred and judgment, the person that you see before you is far better than what you thought. Right? So when you look at someone, you say, this is a good person, this is a bad person. Like, those are all based on your conceptions, things that you've heard, maybe even personal interactions with them. But just because someone acts a particular way in a particular time, right? So like when I'm working in the emergency room or on an inpatient unit, like there's someone who's in restraints, I walk into the room and they're throwing vitriol and toxicity my way. They can say all kinds of nasty things about me, right? So that they're doing things that are objectively bad. And yet, when you give human beings a chance, the human being underneath our conceptions, there's something good there. And if you look at your life, how much of your suffering is due to other people not seeing the human being you are? When they judge you for what they see instead of what you are. When they don't give you the benefit of the doubt. When they don't invite you when they're inviting everybody else. When they choose not to include you because they don't think you're worth it. When you're on the fringe of the popular kids, but you're not one of the popular kids. They're all, back a couple years ago on Twitch, there were all these Among Us lobbies, right? And then there were the cool Among Us lobbies, and there were the not cool Among Us lobbies. Even in your friend group, there's the 10 people on your Discord server, and then 5 of them preferentially group up, and 5 of them get left to the B tier. In a WoW guild, rating guild, right? You've got your A tier team, and you've got your B tier team. How much of your suffering is because people don't give you a chance? You're on Tinder, they don't give you a chance. You have friends, they don't give you a chance. No one gives you a chance. They judge you for what they see. And even worse than that is you judge yourself for what you see, not what you are. Harder to understand. But you judge yourself based on your perceptions of yourself. But your perceptions of yourself are based on what? So this is something that a lot of people don't understand about depression. Depression is not caused by a physiologic imbalance. It's not caused by a social problem. It's not caused even by a psychological problem. If you look at the yogic perspective of depression, as well as Aaron Beck's perspective of depression, what you discover is that depression is a problem of perception. What propagates a depression, see, this is something that's very fascinating. So if you look at the research of why one person becomes depressed and another person does not become depressed, given the same circumstance, it is the way that they perceive things. There is a selection bias in depression, that people who are depressed value or weight, like WEIGHT, negative stimuli more than positive stimuli. Your mind discards the positive and seeks out the negative. There is a perception bias. And if you look at Aaron Beck's original writings on this stuff, he says that the root of the problem, what gets the whole cycle started, is a problem of perception. That you are unable to see the positive. You're not willing to see the positive. And you will see this if you look at other people who are depressed and they say, oh, my life is shit, my life is shit, my life is shit. And you can completely acknowledge, yeah, I know that your life is bad in some ways. I'm not saying it's bad, bro, but it's not shit. Or maybe even it is shit. See, the one thing that we've lost sight of in this society, we work on everything else. We work on physiology, we work on psychology, we work on emotions, we work on social connection. We're aware of all of these problems. The one problem that we are still unaware of on the large and on the whole is our perception. See, when your mind forms a judgment, you do not question the judgment. Right? Why am I thinking this way? No, this is what I think. The reason I think it is because it is true. Right? This is how you have 2 people on opposite ends of this political spectrum. Both of them are 100% sure they're correct. Which one is right and which one is wrong? It doesn't matter. The question is, how did 2 people end up 100% correct in opposite directions? It is a problem of perception. And so even when you form a judgment about yourself, I'm a loser, I'm a winner, did you Were you critical with your perception? See, we receive data and we think that this is data. We think it is correct. And so there's a bunch of stuff going on, between Israel and Palestine and whatnot, where some people believe this and some people believe this. I'm not an expert in that stuff. I'm not going to comment on it. But what I know is that there's a very good chance that people were not critical of what they were perceiving. Or now there was even some talk about that, right? That, this is being indoctrinated and TikTok is pushing this agenda or whatever, right? So there's actually a little bit of awareness. But even in terms of our own mind, forget about TikTok and pushing political agendas and Russian troll farms or whatever. Even in your own mind, when your mind has a thought or has a judgment, or you say this person does not like me, are you critical of it? And this is the problem. When you are not critical of your perceptions, the world that your mind forms is completely out of your control. The world that you live in today is formed by your perceptions. But if your perception is compromised, which is literally what the case is in depression, there is a bias towards the negative. This is a scientific fact. So when you selectively choose the negativity, this constructs your worldview, and then you believe you are living in this world, and the reason you are depressed is because it is so negative. And if someone tells you, hey, the world isn't so negative, you will say, wrong. Here is all of my evidence. And everyone has all this kind of evidence about why their life is this way. It's fine that you have evidence. I'm not disputing that you have evidence. What I'm disputing is whether this was a randomized controlled trial. Was this a rigorous, scientifically blinded, conducted study? The answer to that is absolutely not. Because when it comes to our mind, we don't hold it to that standard. So if you want a new avenue to tackle depression, and I'm not talking about clinically, I'm talking about the way that you see the world. Oh my God, like Tinder, everything is such a mess. Like, things are bad. I'm not saying they're not. But just because things are bad does not mean that the way that you perceive them is accurate. And the purification of perception is like one of the most potent spiritual practices that you can do. Arguably, it's the only one you need. Just to purify your perception, to see things as they are. This is what the Dalai Lama said. The last one, or I think maybe the current one. Right? To see things as they are is the hardest thing for a human being to do. And this is why they have all these techniques in the Zen tradition, which is watch a rock grow. Right? The technique of in this, if y'all are trying to figure out how do I purify my perception, I'll give you guys two options. Give me a second, see if I can find it. Option number 1. Y'all can read the Vishuddhimagga, the path of purification. It doesn't even have page numbers. That's how long it is. It's one of these books that has, like, instead of page numbers, it's got XIV, 27. Doesn't have page numbers. You can read that book. The other thing that you can do is watch. So people are saying, Dr. K, we want you to teach meditation more. Fine. So here's my meditation for y'all for the day. Watch a rock grow. Now, some of y'all that want me to teach meditation, you will say, but that's not the kind of meditation we're talking about. We want you to tell us to close our eyes and breathe this way or focus on this or imagine this or whatever. See, look at already what you're doing. I'm telling you this is a meditation. I'm offering you a meditation. What does your mind do? It says, it's not the one that I want. It's bad. All right, you're coming to me to learn meditation. I tell you to do something and you reject it. Why? Look at that. Look at what your mind does. Right? There's automatically a rejection. Watch a rock grow. Just watch it grow. And then you will say, but Dr. K, a rock cannot grow. And that's when I will say, that's because you haven't looked closely enough. You say a rock can't grow? Have you looked at rocks? Have you seen how big they can become? How did they get that big if they can't grow? Mount Everest is 29,000 feet. That rock has done a lot of good growing in its life, and it started growing thousands of years ago. If they can't grow, how can they get so big? Watch a rock grow with the fullness of your perception. And until you can perceive the growth of a rock, you have not done the practice enough. Okay, the book is the Vishuddhamagga. I wouldn't really recommend it, though. This is the other reason. So people say, Dr. K, do you have a recommended reading list? And I've never said yes. I read lots of books. So I think, honestly, recommended reading lists are stupid. You may say, but Dr. K, what do you mean? How is a recommended reading list stupid? Very simple. Recommendation for whom? I recommend books all the time. But is the internet the same? No. So I can't have a recommended reading list for who? For the internet. See, the value of a recommendation for a book depends on where you are. Right? So, like, I'm not recommending, whether I recommend a textbook on calculus or a book on number theory or a nonfiction book about math and how math is cool or a textbook on arithmetic depends on where you are. The reason I can't make a recommendation is I have no idea where you are. So when someone asks me, do you have a recommendation? That depends. What do you know? That depends. What are your goals? Right? So that's why it's been hard for me. It's not that it's, and I'll take back that I said it's stupid. I mean, I think that so this is where the more specific we get. If you want recommended reading on a particular topic, depending on where you are, that also will change. So I wouldn't recommend Vishuddhamagga. Oddly enough, this is where the other problem is I don't know. I mean, so this is why I've taken my recommended reading list is going to be the books that I write, because that's really what I need to do. That's my best answer right now. And that's not like oh my God, buy my book. That's like for the things for where I perceive that y'all are, it's not one book. Because y'all have gotten to me. I mean, come up with me. Right? You're part of this community. So I know that anything that I recommend will not satisfy you. It won't be enough. Because y'all like what I have to teach, right? And what I teach is an amalgamation of everything that I've read. It's not one slice of that. If you want a book on Introduction to Ayurveda, read Ayurvedic Healing by David Frawley. If you want an introductory book on spirituality, read Eknath Easwaran's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. But even that I'm questioning nowadays. Because like the Bhagavad Gita is a text that I think is a lot more useful way down the road. Like it's an introductory text, but it's very deep. And I didn't understand, I still don't I'm just getting into it now. And I've been doing this for about 20 years. So that's the other thing that really confuses me. It's kind of like in English class when they're having you read like Hamlet at the age of 14. I'm so confused. I think like some of that stuff is good now. But when I was 14 years old, like I didn't understand what this is talking about. So that's why I mean, maybe there's a good way to recommend books. This is why we're working on bibliographies, right? We have them, we just don't upload them. So that's why when like we're working on like better like sourcing for the things that we make and stuff like that, it's just a process problem. We're just bad at it. And I'm to blame. Right? And that's the other big problem is I read a lot of primary literature. Like I read like research papers. Like this is my, is like the biology of coping, right? I talked about this paper some time ago, but there's like all kinds of stuff that I read. I mean, like I'm reading, so this is for this coming week. Hypoactive Sexual Desire Disorder, a review of epidemiology, biopsychology, diagnosis, and treatment. I mean, we'll have references this Friday. So, sorry, y'all. I will try to come up with a better answer. So I think Gardens of the Moon is super interesting, but it's also kind of a slog. If you guys want a book recommendation, here's one. Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Great book. Great book. I'll come up with a reading list one day, okay? This is just sometimes I get crotchety in my old age. I get crotchety. I'm like, man, I don't want to. Man. I'll get better. I'll do better. Okay? Meditations is also pretty good. But like, here's my problem with meditation. It's a good book, okay? So if you read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, you guys want to know why I think Marcus Aurelius' Meditations is an awful book? Because in the first couple pages, he's like, from my father, I learned how to be disciplined. From my uncle, I learned how to be compassionate. From this person, I learned this. And for this person, I learned this. So the first time I read Meditations, I was like, bruh, I don't care where you learned it. I want to learn how to be those things. Right? And I mean, I think it's a good book. It's good. It's worth reading. But this is what I mean. So see, if someone had recommended Marcus Aurelius' Meditations to me, and no one did, I was not in a place to receive it. So it's not a good recommendation. That's the real challenge that I run into with recommendations. I have not read the Communist Manifesto. I mean, I read Hermann Hesse and maybe Camus like back when I was required, but I haven't really read them. Have I read the Mahabharata? I've read parts of the Mahabharata. Parts of Man's Search for Meaning. Okay, so Metka Butane is saying, meditation is sort of a psychic pain to me. I don't understand how people do it. We have a video coming out about that soon. And then we also have a meditation guide if you want to check that out. But we have a video about meditation coming out about what to do if meditation is hard for you and doesn't work for you. I have read Autobiography of a Yogi. I think it's interesting. Okay. All right, let's raid Dan Clancy, Dan Chad. And then we'll see y'all on we'll see y'all on Friday with another. Which one do I do? This one? Hold on. I haven't done this in a while. Raid channel. What is Dan Clancy's channel? Oh my god. What is Dan's channel? Oh, DJ Clancy. There we go. That's hilarious. I put in Dan Clancy and it's like Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six. Okay. We'll see y'all on Friday with the lecture on asexuality. Thank y'all very much for coming today. And have a good week. Let's go. Let's go, let's go, let's go. And this guy, poor guy, gets like 250 concurrent viewers. So let's send Dan some love. Let's raid this small streamer. All right, y'all take care. But isn't it cool that he streams on the platform?